It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Michael Smith walked into his opulent mansion, the heavy wooden doors closing behind him with a soft thud. The house was as grand as ever, spacious halls adorned with priceless art, polished floors that gleamed under the soft lighting, and tall windows that framed the meticulously kept gardens outside. Everything was in place, just as it had been for years. But today, something felt different. It wasn't just the familiar stillness of the house, there was a new presence. As Michael hung his coat on the bronze rack by the entrance, he heard light footsteps approaching. Turning toward the sound, he expected to see James, the ever-efficient butler, but instead a young woman appeared at the end of the hallway, holding a tray with fresh flowers. She was dressed in the standard Maid uniform, her posture slightly nervous but composed. Michael paused, his eyes narrowing in curiosity. He hadn't been informed of any new staff. He opened his mouth to call out to her, but something caught his eye, the thin, glimmering necklace around her neck. His breath hitched. It was impossible not to notice. The delicate silver chain held a small, intricately carved locket. That locket. His mind raced back 18 years to the last time he had seen his daughter. She had been only 4, full of life and always laughing, and around her neck had been that same locket, a gift from her grandmother, one she never took off. The same locket that was now resting on the chest of this unfamiliar maid. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen, the weight of the memory crashing into him with full force. The young woman, Hello, viewer. Thank you for being here. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. Now let's continue with the story. The young woman, Claire, unaware of his reaction, continued her work. She placed the flowers on the side table in the hallway, adjusting them with delicate care. Michael snapped out of his daze, clearing his throat as he approached. "You there?" he called out, his voice firm but slightly strained. "What's your name?" Claire turned, startled by his sudden presence. She straightened up quickly, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. I'm Claire, sir, the new maid." Michael's eyes drifted again to the locket. "Boo, where did you get that necklace?" Claire's fingers instinctively touched the locket, a gesture of comfort she had done since she could remember. She hesitated, sensing the tension in his voice, but answered as honestly as she could. "I've had this for as long as I can remember, sir. It was given to me at the orphanage. They said I was found with it." Michael's expression shifted. He took a step closer, his mind racing. Could it be? Could this woman be? His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden arrival of James, the butler, who appeared from a side door carrying a tray with tea. James, always observant, immediately sensed the tension in the air. His eyes flicked from Michael to Claire, then back to Michael, before setting the tray down on a nearby table. "Is everything all right, Mr. Smith?" James asked, his voice polite but with an underlying firmness, as if warning Michael not to create a scene. Michael blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. "Yes," he finally muttered, his eyes still fixed on Claire. "Everything is fine." But it wasn't. Not for Michael. Claire excused herself quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. The way Michael had looked at her, the intense, almost haunted expression in his eyes, unnerved her. She hurried to the kitchen, her mind spinning with questions. What was that about? Why was he so interested in my necklace? James, who had remained with Michael, spoke once Claire was out of earshot. "She's the new maid," James explained, his voice low and measured. "Hired through an agency. She just started this week." Michael didn't respond immediately. His gaze was still locked on the hallway where Claire had disappeared. His mind was reeling with the possibility. Could she be his daughter? Without another word, Michael turned on his heel and headed toward his study, leaving James standing in confusion. Upstairs in the mansion, Michael sat behind his large oak desk, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled open a drawer. Inside was a small velvet box, worn from years of being handled, but still intact. He opened it carefully, revealing a small photograph of a bright-eyed little girl, her smile wide and infectious. Around her neck, The same locket glittered in the sunlight. He closed his eyes, the pain of loss washing over him once more. His daughter had disappeared 18 years ago, vanished from the park where she had been playing while his wife had briefly turned her back. They had searched everywhere, hired the best detectives, put out public pleas, but she had never been found. The loss had nearly destroyed him and his wife, Sarah. Their marriage had survived, but the void of their daughter's absence had remained like a shadow over their lives. But now, here was this young woman, Claire, with the same locket, the same face structure, the same soft eyes. Could it really be her? He had to know. Meanwhile, downstairs in the kitchen, Claire tried to calm her nerves. James entered quietly, his usual severe expression softening slightly as he observed her. Though James was a strict butler, his sharp eye caught every detail, and right now he noticed the way Claire's hands shook as she tried to busy herself with cleaning. "You seem unsettled," James remarked, his voice void of sympathy but not unkind. Claire stopped what she was doing and turned to face him. "Mr. Smith, he seemed upset with me. I don't know what I did wrong." James sighed, adjusting his cufflinks. "Mr. Smith is a complicated man. His moods shift." Claire nodded, though it did little to ease her worries. She had only been working here a few days, and already she felt like she had done something wrong. What was it about the necklace? Why had he asked about it? James moved closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. "If I were you, I'd focus on my work and not ask too many questions." Claire frowned slightly but nodded. She was just starting here after all. It wouldn't do her any good to pry into matters that didn't concern her, but even as she returned to her tasks, the nagging question remained in her mind. Why did Michael care so much about my locket? Upstairs, Michael picked up his phone, dialing the number of his private investigator, David Dodge, a man who had handled many delicate matters for the Smith family over the years. As the line rang, Michael's heart raced with anticipation. When David answered, Michael wasted no time. "I need you to look into someone," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "Her name is Claire, and I need to know everything about her." As Michael ended the call, he stared out the large window of his study, his mind consumed with one thought. Could Claire be his long-lost daughter? The cold wind swept through the streets of the small town as Claire stepped out of the orphanage for what would be the last time. She stood for a moment on the front steps, taking in the large, old building that had been her home for the past 18 years. The weathered bricks, the chipped paint on the windows, the worn wooden door, these things were all too familiar to her. This place held all the memories of her childhood, but none of them were of family. Her memories were of shared rooms, other children who came and went, and the constant rotation of caretakers. And always, there was that locket around her neck, a mystery she never solved. The locket had been the only thing she had when she was found at 2 years old, wandering alone in a park with no memory of her family. The police had searched for her parents, put out announcements, but no one had ever come forward. She had been just another lost child. Claire often wondered who she had belonged to, but as the years passed, she stopped asking questions. The past was gone, and no one had answers. Now she had to focus on her future. As she adjusted the straps of her worn-out bag on her shoulder, Claire took a deep breath and began walking. Her new job at the Smith mansion was the first step toward a life outside the orphanage, a chance to start fresh. The job had come through an agency that specialized in placing girls like her into domestic work. It wasn't her dream to be a maid, but it was a good opportunity, especially since the salary was decent and she would be living on site. It meant stability, something Claire had always craved but never truly known. The streets felt cold and unfriendly as she made her way to the bus station. She wasn't sure what to expect when she arrived at the mansion, but she knew one thing. She was determined to succeed. There would be no going back to the orphanage. This was her chance to make something of herself. The bus ride to the mansion felt long, each mile stretching out in front of her like an uncertain road. As the city streets gave way to rolling hills and sprawling estates, Claire's nerves began to grow. She had never been in a place like this before. The wealth and grandeur of the neighborhood she passed were overwhelming, a stark contrast to the modest orphanage where she had spent most of her life. When the bus finally stopped near the estate, Claire hesitated for a moment before stepping off. The air was cooler here, the surroundings quieter. The tall iron gates of the Smith mansion loomed ahead, impressive and intimidating. She could see the long driveway leading up to the grand house in the distance. It was like stepping into another world, a place so far removed from anything she had ever known. With a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and approached the intercom at the gate. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed the button. "Yes," a voice crackled through the speaker. It's Claire," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "The new maid." There was a brief pause. Then the gates slowly swung open with a quiet hum. Claire walked through, her heart pounding as the mansion loomed larger with each step. The grandeur of it all was overwhelming. Perfectly manicured lawns, a fountain in the center of the circular driveway, and towering trees that lined the property. It was nothing like the orphanage, nothing like the small town she was used to. When she reached the front doors, they opened before she could knock. A tall man in a black suit stood before her, James, the butler. His face was stern, his posture rigid, exuding an air of formality that immediately made Claire feel small. "You're late," James said, his voice crisp and authoritative. "The staff briefing was at 10 a.m. Claire swallowed hard, flustered. I'm sorry. The bus was delayed." James looked her up and down, clearly unimpressed, before stepping aside to allow her in. "Follow me. I'll show you to your quarters and explain your duties." Claire stepped into the mansion, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the marble floors. She felt out of place immediately. The high ceilings, the expensive artwork, the gleaming chandeliers, it all felt like a dream, one she didn't quite belong in. James led her through a series of hallways, explaining the layout of the house as they went. His tone was clipped, professional, and lacked any warmth. "You will be expected to maintain a high standard here," he said as they walked. "Mr. and Mrs. Smith expect nothing less. If you are not prepared for that, you will not last long." Claire nodded silently, her nerves growing with every step they took. She couldn't afford to lose this job. She had nowhere else to go. James's cold demeanor did little to ease her anxiety, but she kept her head down and followed, determined not to let her insecurities show. That first night, as Claire lay in her small room in the servants' quarters, she thought about her new life. It had been a long, exhausting day of cleaning, organizing, and learning the routines of the house. James had not hesitated to criticize her every mistake, reminding her repeatedly that the Smith household ran on precision and perfection. It was clear to her that James didn't think she would last, but Claire was determined to prove him wrong. As she stared up at the ceiling, the sounds of the house settling in for the night around her, her thoughts drifted back to her past, to the orphanage, to the locket. She reached up and touched it, the small, familiar piece of jewelry that had been with her for as long as she could remember. The one thing from her past she held on to. She had asked the caretakers at the orphanage about it many times, but no one knew anything. She had been found alone in a park, wearing the locket and nothing else that would help identify her. No birth certificate, no family name, just Claire, the girl with the silver locket. What did it mean? Where had she come from? These questions haunted her in the quiet moments, like tonight. But there were no answers, no clues, just the locket and the endless wondering. Claire closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. Tomorrow was another day, another chance to prove herself, another step toward creating a new life. The next morning, Claire woke early, determined to start the day right. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, eager to begin her duties before James had a chance to reprimand her. But as she passed through the hallway, she noticed the grand staircase leading up to the private quarters of the house. The curiosity pulled at her. She had been told her duties were confined to the lower levels, the kitchen, the dining room, the servants' areas. but she couldn't help but wonder about the lives of the people she was now working for. Who were Mr. and Mrs. Smith? She had seen glimpses of Mr. Smith the day before, tall, distinguished, but with a quiet sadness in his eyes. And Mrs. Smith, she had yet to meet her, though the other staff had mentioned she rarely left her rooms. Claire paused at the base of the staircase, staring up at the opulence that seemed so far removed from her own life. She was about to turn away when she heard a soft voice. "Who are you?" Claire jumped, her heart racing as she turned to see an older woman standing at the top of the stairs. She was elegantly dressed, her hair perfectly styled, though her face held a look of weariness. This had to be Sarah Smith, the matriarch of the house. I'm Claire, Ma'am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The new maid." Sarah's eyes drifted over Claire, her gaze softening for a moment before she turned away without another word, disappearing down the hallway. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had been told that Mrs. Smith was a recluse, a woman who kept to herself, distant from the day-to-day workings of the household. But there had been something in her eyes, something sad, something haunted, just like her husband. Claire shook her head, reminding herself to focus. She had a job to do, and no matter how mysterious the Smiths seemed, she was here to work, not to pry into their lives. As she walked toward the kitchen, her hand instinctively went to her locket once more. The same question echoed in her mind as it had for years. Where do I come from? Claire awoke early the next morning, the faint light of dawn filtering through the small window in her room. Her mind was already racing with thoughts of the previous day. The Smith mansion was unlike any place she had ever been. So elegant, so vast, and yet there was a heavy sadness that seemed to linger in the air. She hadn't interacted much with Mr. or Mrs. Smith, but the tension from her encounter with Michael Smith still hung over her like a dark cloud. And then there was James. From the moment she arrived, it was clear James, the butler, didn't trust her. His cold demeanor, the way his eyes followed her every move, made her feel like she was always on the verge of making a mistake. And today, she had to face him again. As Claire quickly dressed in her maid's uniform, she gave herself a pep talk. Just do your job. Don't let him get to you. She tied the apron around her waist and slipped her shoes on, her hands brushing the locket around her neck. It was her constant companion, a symbol of her unknown past, but today it felt like a reminder of the strange tension in the house. The staff quarters were quiet as Claire made her way down the narrow hallway. She had learned quickly that the Smiths' mansion ran on a strict schedule. Breakfast was served precisely at 7 a.m., and everything had to be in perfect order by then. James had made it abundantly clear that any slip-ups would not be tolerated. When she reached the kitchen, the other staff were already bustling about. Clara, the head housekeeper, was overseeing the meal preparations, her sharp eyes darting from one task to another. Clara had been kinder to Claire than James, but there was still an air of caution around her, as if she wasn't yet convinced Claire could handle the job. "Good morning, Claire," Clara said as Claire entered the room, her voice brisk but not unkind. "I trust you slept well." "Yes, ma'am. Thank you," Claire replied quickly, eager to prove herself. "Good. We'll need you to handle the dining room this morning. Make sure everything is spotless. Mr. Smith likes his routine, and the table must be set perfectly." Claire nodded and grabbed the cleaning supplies from the cupboard. As she exited the kitchen, she felt a pair of eyes on her and glanced back to see James watching her from the corner, his face expressionless but his posture rigid. He didn't say a word, but his presence was enough to make her stomach tighten with nerves. The dining room was as grand as the rest of the mansion. An intricately carved wooden table stretched across the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed chairs upholstered in dark, rich fabric. Massive windows overlooked the sprawling gardens outside, and the morning light cast a soft glow on the room. Despite its beauty, the room felt cold and formal, much like the people who dined here. Claire set to work, dusting the surfaces, polishing the silverware, and making sure every detail was in place. She moved quickly but carefully, determined not to give James any reason to criticize her. Her mind wandered as she worked, replaying her interactions with the family so far. The strange way Mr. Smith had looked at her necklace, the sadness in Mrs. Smith's eyes, and the ever-present watchfulness of James. It all made her feel like there was something going on beneath the surface, something she didn't understand. As she finished setting the table, James entered the room, his footsteps soft but deliberate. Claire straightened up, her heart racing slightly as he approached. "Have you completed the preparations?" he asked, his voice as cold as ever. "Yes, sir," Claire replied, trying to keep her voice steady. James walked around the table, inspecting her work with a critical eye. His expression remained unreadable as he moved from one end of the room to the other, his hands clasped behind his back. "This is acceptable," he said after a long pause. But barely. Claire felt a sting of frustration at his words, but forced herself to remain calm. She knew arguing would do no good. Instead, she nodded and waited for further instructions. James stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he spoke. "Let me make one thing clear, Claire. The Smith household has a reputation for excellence, and I will not tolerate anything less than perfection from the staff. If you are unable to meet those standards, you will be replaced." His words were like ice, sending a chill down her spine. "I understand, sir. I'll do my best." "Your best may not be enough," James said, his voice dripping with disdain. "We'll see." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Claire standing there, her hands clenched at her sides. She took a deep breath, willing herself not to let his words get to her. But it wasn't easy. Every moment in this house felt like a test, and she wasn't sure if she was passing. Later that day, Claire was cleaning one of the sitting rooms when she overheard a conversation between Mrs. Smith and James. The door to the sitting room was slightly ajar, and their voices carried through the hallway. Claire paused, not wanting to eavesdrop, but unable to stop herself from listening. "She's too young," Mrs. Smith said, her voice quiet, but filled with a kind of sadness. "I don't want someone like her around." "She's here to work, Mum," James replied, his tone as formal as ever. "I will ensure she stays focused on her duties." There was a long pause, and Claire held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Was Mrs. Smith talking about her? "I don't care," Mrs. Smith said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't bear it. It's too much. She reminds me." James cut her off gently. "I understand, Mum. I'll take care of it." Claire stepped back from the door, her heart racing. She had no idea what they were talking about, but it felt personal, like she had somehow stirred up something painful in this family. The tension between Mrs. Smith and James was palpable, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with her. The rest of the day passed in a blur of cleaning and tasks, but Claire couldn't stop thinking about what she had overheard. Why didn't Mrs. Smith want her there? She had barely spoken to the woman, yet there was something about her presence that clearly bothered Mrs. Smith deeply. That night, as she lay in bed, Claire stared up at the ceiling, her mind whirling with questions. She had thought this job would be a fresh start, a chance to build a new life, but now it felt like she had stepped into a place full of secrets, a place where she didn't belong. The mansion was beautiful, but it was also lonely. The staff kept to themselves, and the Smith family seemed distant, shrouded in their own private pain. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on, something that no one was telling her. As she closed her eyes, her hand drifted to the locket around her neck, the one connection she had to her past. She had always believed that the locket was special, that it held some clue about who she was. But now, it felt like a burden. Every time Mr. Smith looked at it, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, and it terrified her. Why was this locket so important to him? And why did Mrs. Smith seem to fear her presence? The questions kept Claire awake long into the night, the answers just out of reach. Claire's first week at the Smith mansion was more difficult than she had imagined. She had anticipated the job would be demanding. Cleaning, cooking, and maintaining a household this large required attention to detail and long hours. But what she hadn't expected was the constant pressure of James, the butler, who seemed determined to find fault in everything she did. It wasn't just the tasks that were overwhelming. The atmosphere in the house was tense, and Claire often felt like she was walking on eggshells. Every corner of the mansion seemed to hold a secret, and the cold reception from the family made it clear she was an outsider. Still, she had no choice but to continue. This job was her only lifeline, and she couldn't afford to fail. On her fourth day, Claire found herself in the grand dining room once again, polishing the silverware that seemed to sparkle under the crystal chandelier. Her hands worked quickly, trying to make up for lost time after having to re-clean the study at James's insistence. Everything had to be perfect, and her anxiety grew with every minute she spent under James's critical gaze. As she worked, her mind replayed the events of the past few days, the coldness from Mrs. Smith, the intense stares from Mr. Smith, and the overheard conversation between the two continued to bother her. They acted like her presence was a disruption, but she couldn't understand why. And there was always the locket. Its connection to Mr. Smith was undeniable, but she had no idea what it could mean. Just as she finished setting the table, James appeared in the doorway. His presence alone was enough to make her stomach clench in nervousness. "Claire," he called out, his tone sharp. "You missed a spot on the silver." She turned quickly, her heart pounding. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll fix it right away." James approached the table, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the silverware closely. "You must learn to pay attention to detail. Mr. Smith values perfection, and anything less will not be tolerated." "I understand," Claire replied quietly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She grabbed the polishing cloth and started on the spot he pointed out, trying her best to hide her frustration. No matter how hard she worked, James always found something to criticize. "You've been here for almost a week," James said, standing over her as she polished, "and yet you're still making mistakes." Claire bit her lip, resisting the urge to snap back. She knew James was testing her, pushing her to see how far she could be pushed. She had heard stories about tough butlers before, but James seemed to take pleasure in reminding her of every error she made, no matter how small. "I'll do better," she said through clenched teeth, trying to stay calm. "I promise." James leaned in closer, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "I hope for your sake that you do. I won't be as forgiving next time." Without waiting for a response, he turned and left the room, leaving Claire standing there with the polishing cloth still in her hand. She stared after him, her frustration bubbling up inside her. Why did he hate her so much? What had she done to deserve this treatment? Later that afternoon, as Claire made her way through the halls with a tray of tea for Mrs. Smith, she overheard another conversation between the family's lawyer, Robert Dew, and Mr. Smith. They were in Mr. Smith's study, the door slightly ajar, and their voices, though hushed, carried enough for her to catch fragments of what was being discussed. "It's a delicate situation, Michael," Robert was saying. "You can't just assume. We need more proof before taking any drastic action." Michael's voice was firm, but filled with an undercurrent of emotion. "I know what I saw, Robert. That locket, it's identical to the one she had when she disappeared." Claire froze in place just outside the study, her breath catching in her throat. They were talking about her locket again. Her fingers brushed against the pendant, feeling its familiar weight against her skin. What could it possibly mean? "There are dozens of similar designs out there," Robert replied. "You can't jump to conclusions based on a piece of jewelry." Michael let out a frustrated sigh. "It's not just the locket. There's something about her. I need to know the truth." "Then do it the right way," Robert insisted. "Hire someone to look into her past. Find out where she really came from." Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she hurried away, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping. Her hands shook as she continued toward Mrs. Smith's room, her mind racing with the implications of what she had heard. Why were they so interested in her? Why did they think the locket meant something? She delivered the tea to Mrs. Smith, who barely acknowledged her presence, then retreated back to the safety of the servants' quarters. There, in the privacy of her small room, She sat on the edge of her bed and clutched the locket tightly in her hand. The conversation she had overheard confirmed what she had suspected. Mr. Smith believed there was something significant about her locket. But why? She had always known it was the only clue to her past. She had clung to it as a child, hoping one day it would help her understand where she came from. But now it seemed like the locket held a connection to this family. Could it be possible that she was somehow linked to them? The idea seemed far-fetched, but it also felt like the only explanation for the strange way Mr. and Mrs. Smith acted around her. The next day, Claire tried to focus on her work, but her mind was consumed with questions. She moved through her tasks in a daze, her thoughts spinning as she tried to make sense of everything. As she dusted the shelves in the library, she replayed the conversation she had overheard again and again. What were they planning to do? Would they try to find out who she really was? By mid-afternoon, James found her again. This time, he was inspecting the work she had done in the sitting room. As usual, he found something wrong. "You missed a spot on the windows," he said coldly, pointing to a faint streak on the glass. "It's unacceptable." Claire swallowed hard, her frustration reaching a boiling point. She had worked tirelessly all day, and yet nothing she did was good enough for him. "I'm doing my best," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "Your best isn't good enough," James snapped, "and if you can't meet the standards of this household, you won't last here." The words stung, but Claire refused to back down this time. "I'm trying," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "I've only been here a few days, and I'm still learning." James's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Claire thought he might actually fire her on the spot. But instead, he simply sneered, "Then learn faster." He turned and walked away, leaving Claire standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been spoken to like that before, and the sting of his words made her feel small and powerless. But deep down, a fire had been lit. She wasn't going to let James push her out of this job. She needed this work, and she wasn't going to give up just because he didn't like her. That evening, Claire sat alone in the garden, the cool night air soothing her frayed nerves. The garden had quickly become her refuge, a place where she could escape the pressures of the household and gather her thoughts. Surrounded by the fragrant flowers and the sound of the fountain's gentle trickle, she could almost forget the tension that filled the mansion. Almost. She stared down at the locket in her hand, her thumb brushing over its smooth surface. What does this mean? The same question had been haunting her for years, but now it seemed more urgent than ever. If the Smith family thought it was important, then maybe it was more than just a simple piece of jewelry. Maybe it really was the key to her past, but as much as she wanted answers, she was also afraid of what she might find. What if she wasn't ready to know the truth? She let out a long breath, her thoughts swirling. There was so much she didn't understand, so many pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit. But one thing was certain. She couldn't run away. Not this time. She had to stay and find out who she really was, no matter how difficult it might be. "I'm not going anywhere," she thought determinedly, clutching the locket tight. "I'll figure this out." As the sun rose over the Smith mansion, casting long shadows across the manicured gardens, Claire awoke with a renewed sense of resolve. She had spent the last several nights tossing and turning, her mind racing with questions about her past, about the locket, and about the strange behavior of the Smith family. But now, she was determined. She wasn't going to let the cold reception from James or the discomfort she felt in the mansion shake her focus. Claire needed this job, not only for financial reasons, but because something told her there was more to her connection to this place than mere coincidence. The locket around her neck, the one clue she had to her past, seemed to trigger something in Michael Smith, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her story was somehow intertwined with the secrets of this family. After dressing quickly in her maid's uniform, Claire headed down the narrow servants' staircase that led to the kitchen. Today would be different, she told herself. She would push through the challenges, no matter how hard James was on her or how cold Mrs. Smith seemed she was determined to prove her worth and, more importantly, uncover the truth. As soon as she entered the kitchen, Clara, the head housekeeper, greeted her with a curt nod. "You're on breakfast duty today, Claire," Clara said, her voice brisk. "Make sure everything is ready before 7 a.m. sharp. Mr. Smith has a meeting and won't tolerate any delays." Claire nodded quickly. She had learned fast that Mr. Smith's schedule was sacred, and any disruptions would not be taken lightly. Breakfast in the Smith household was a formal affair, with precision and timing more important than anything else. She set to work immediately, helping to prepare the fruit platters, brewing the fresh coffee, and making sure the dining table was set perfectly. Every napkin had to be folded just right, every utensil placed at precise angles. Claire's hands moved quickly, her focus intense. She could feel the eyes of James on her, even though he hadn't said a word yet. His silent judgment had become a constant presence, and she knew he was waiting for her to make a mistake. By the time breakfast was ready, Claire had made sure everything was in perfect order. As she stepped back to admire the pristine setup, James entered the room, his sharp gaze moving over the table. He nodded slightly, which for James was as close to a compliment as she would ever get. "Acceptable," he said coldly. "Make sure the coffee stays fresh. Mr. Smith will be down shortly." Claire nodded, trying to hide the small wave of satisfaction that rose in her chest. She had done well today, and it felt like a small victory. But as always, James was quick to remind her that there was no room for error. "Don't let this small success go to your head," James added as he turned to leave. "One mistake and you'll be out." The words stung, but Claire had grown used to his sharpness. She took a deep breath and focused on the task at hand, determined to ignore his constant criticisms. After breakfast, Claire found herself with a moment of quiet in the garden, her favorite place to reflect. The garden had become her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the pressures of the house, even if just for a few minutes. The soft trickling of the fountain and the scent of blooming flowers helped to calm her nerves. Sitting on a stone bench, Claire absent-mindedly fingered the locket around her neck. What is it about this locket? The question haunted her every day. It was the only piece of her past she had, the only clue to where she came from. And now, being in this house, it felt like the locket was more important than ever. Michael Smith had recognized it, or at least he had reacted to it, and though he hadn't said anything directly, Claire could feel that he was watching her, waiting for something. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Claire looked up to see Mrs. Smith, Sarah, walking slowly through the garden. It was rare to see her outside her room, and Claire was immediately on edge. She quickly stood up, ready to offer assistance or leave if needed. Mrs. Smith paused a few feet away from Claire, her eyes scanning the flowers, but never truly focusing on anything. She seemed distant, her expression soft but filled with a quiet sorrow. There was a sadness about her that Claire had noticed from the beginning, but now, seeing her up close in the gentle morning light, it was even more apparent. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Mrs. Smith said suddenly, her voice soft as she gestured to the roses lining the path. Claire nodded, unsure of what to say. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Smith's eyes flicked briefly to Claire, and for a moment it seemed like she might say more, but then she turned away again, her attention drifting back to the garden. Claire waited, unsure if she should stay or leave. She had been told to keep her interactions with the family to a minimum, but this felt different. There was something in Mrs. Smith's demeanor that made Claire feel like she should stay. After a long silence, Mrs. Smith finally spoke again, her voice low and almost fragile. "Do you know much about flowers, Claire?" "Not really, Mum," Claire replied, her voice soft. Mrs. Smith gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "They're delicate things, flowers. They need the right care, the right attention. If you neglect them, they wither." Claire nodded, sensing there was more to Mrs. Smith's words than just a simple statement about flowers. But before she could respond, Mrs. Smith turned away completely, walking slowly back toward the house without another word. Claire watched her go, a strange feeling settling over her. Mrs. Smith's words lingered in her mind. Neglect them, and they wither. Was she talking about the garden, or something else? The rest of the day passed quickly, with Claire moving from one task to the next, her thoughts still clouded by the brief encounter with Mrs. Smith. There was something so haunting about the woman, something that made Claire feel like she was carrying a heavy burden. And then there was Mr. Smith, whose watchful eyes seemed to follow Claire wherever she went. That evening, after a long day of work, Claire returned to her small room in the servants' quarters, her body aching from the constant cleaning and running around. She sat on the edge of her bed, the locket still clutched in her hand, and let out a long sigh. She had made it through another day. But how much longer could she endure the tension in this house, the constant scrutiny from James, the coldness from Mrs. Smith, the unspoken questions from Mr. Smith? It was all wearing her down. But at the same time, Claire knew she couldn't leave. There was something here, something she needed to discover, and until she did, she wasn't going anywhere. As she lay back on her bed, staring up at the ceiling, Claire made a silent vow to herself. She would uncover the truth about her past. She would find out why this locket mattered so much and why the Smith family seemed so affected by it. But she would have to be patient. She couldn't rush things. The answers would come, eventually. For now, she would do her job, keep her head down, and wait for the pieces to fall into place. The days in the Smith mansion were beginning to blur together for Claire. The constant cleaning, the relentless scrutiny from James, and the cold distance of Mrs. Smith weighed heavily on her. The tension in the house never seemed to lift, and it left her feeling isolated and anxious, as though she were always one mistake away from being dismissed. But there was one place in the mansion where she felt a sense of calm: the garden. The Smith mansion's garden was vast, filled with carefully maintained flower beds, old oak trees that towered over the estate, and a stone fountain in the center that bubbled softly, providing a soothing soundtrack to her moments of solitude. Claire had discovered early on that the garden was where she could escape the intensity of the house, even if only for a few minutes. It was a Saturday afternoon, and after finishing her morning tasks, Claire found herself drawn once again to the garden. The air was crisp, the sky a soft blue, and the scent of blooming roses filled her senses. She settled onto her usual bench near the fountain, the sound of water gently lapping against the stone, soothing her frayed nerves. Here, in the garden, Claire could breathe. She could let go of the constant pressure she felt inside the mansion and allow her mind to wander. She often found herself thinking about her childhood, or rather, the lack of it. Growing up in an orphanage had meant no family, no memories of parents, just an endless cycle of caretakers and other children who came and went. The only constant in her life had been the locket, the one link to a past she didn't remember. Her fingers instinctively reached for the locket, tracing the familiar patterns on its surface. It was comforting to have it with her, even though it was also the source of so many unanswered questions. Why had Mr. Smith reacted so strongly to it? What connection did it have to his family? These questions haunted her, but she had no answers. Not yet. The soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path pulled Claire from her thoughts. She looked up to see Michael Smith approaching. His expression was somber, as it usually was, but there was something softer in his eyes today, a hint of the man he might have been before the weight of loss had settled over him. "Claire," he said quietly as he approached, his hands tucked into the pockets of his suit jacket. "May I join you?" Claire was startled by the request, but nodded, unsure of what to say. Mr. Smith rarely spoke to her, and when he did, it was brief and formal. To have him seek her out in the garden was unexpected. Michael sat down beside her on the stone bench, his gaze drifting over the flowers that surrounded them. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Claire wondered if he was regretting his decision to come out here. But then he spoke, his voice soft, almost wistful. "This garden was my wife's favorite place," he said. "She used to spend hours here, tending to the flowers, planting new ones every season. It brought her peace. Claire listened in silence, unsure of how to respond. She had noticed Mrs. Smith's quiet sadness, her distance from everything that went on in the household. It was clear she carried a heavy burden, though Claire had no idea what it was. "She doesn't come here much anymore," Michael continued, his voice tinged with regret. "Not since," he trailed off, his expression tightening. Claire didn't need him to finish the sentence. She had pieced together enough to know that the Smiths had lost someone important, perhaps a child. The way Mr. Smith looked at her locket, the haunted look in his eyes whenever he saw her, it all pointed to a deep wound that hadn't healed. "Do you enjoy the garden?" Michael asked, turning his gaze toward her. "Yes," Claire replied softly. "It's peaceful." Michael nodded, his eyes distant. "It used to be a place of happiness. Now it's just a reminder of what we lost." Claire swallowed, unsure of what to say. She had no family of her own, no memories of loss like Mr. Smith's, but she understood the weight of loneliness, the feeling of being adrift with no connection to the past. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the soft bubbling of the fountain. Then Michael's eyes flickered to the locket around Claire's neck, and the familiar look of recognition passed over his face. "Claire," he said slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "That locket, where did you get it?" Claire hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal, but she had held this secret for too long, and Mr. Smith's questions had haunted her for weeks now. She couldn't keep evading them. "I've had it for as long as I can remember," Claire said quietly, her fingers tightening around the locket. "I was found with it when I was a child. I don't know where it came from." Michael's face paled slightly, and he looked away, his jaw tightening. It was clear that her words had confirmed something for him, though Claire had no idea what. "I've seen that locket before," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It belonged to my daughter." Claire's breath caught in her throat. His daughter. "She was wearing it the day she disappeared," Michael continued, his voice heavy with grief. "We searched everywhere for her, but she was never found. The locket was the only thing we had left of her." Claire stared at him, her mind spinning. How could this be? The locket had always been a part of her, a symbol of her unknown past. But now, Mr. Smith was saying it belonged to his daughter. Could it be possible that she was... "No," Claire said quietly, shaking her head. "That can't be. I was found in a park when I was 2. I grew up in an orphanage. I don't remember anything before that." Michael looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and uncertainty. "We lost her when she was 4. She was taken from a park, and we never saw her again." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. The pieces didn't fit perfectly, but there were too many coincidences to ignore. Could she really be the daughter they had lost all those years ago? Could this locket be the key to unlocking the truth about who she was? "I don't know," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm your daughter." Michael stood abruptly, his emotions clearly overwhelming him. "We'll find out," he said firmly. "I'll have the answers, one way or another." He turned and walked away, leaving Claire sitting alone by the fountain, her mind reeling from the conversation. Could it be true? Could she really be their daughter? Claire clutched the locket tightly in her hand, her heart racing. She had spent her entire life wondering where she came from, but she had never imagined that the answer could be something like this. If what Mr. Smith was saying was true, then her whole life had been a lie. But there were still so many questions. How had she ended up in that park? Why had no one found her? And if she really was the Smiths' daughter, what would that mean for her future? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the garden, Claire stood up from the bench. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. But one thing was clear. She needed to know the truth, and she wasn't going to rest until she found it. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she clasped the locket around her neck. The weight of Michael Smith's words still echoed in her mind. "It belonged to my daughter." How could that be possible? She had always believed the locket was a remnant of a family she had never known, a mystery tied to a past she couldn't remember. But now, the possibility that she might be connected to the Smith family, it felt too surreal, too overwhelming. Her entire world had been turned upside down in that brief conversation by the fountain. Could she really be the daughter they lost? The thought sent waves of confusion and uncertainty through her. There were no memories of her life before the orphanage, no recollections of being part of a family. But the locket, the one constant in her life, had triggered something deep inside Mr. Smith. The way he looked at her, as if he was seeing a ghost from the past, made it impossible to ignore the possibility. That night, sleep was impossible. Claire lay awake in her small room, her thoughts spinning. What would it mean if she was truly their daughter? Would it change her life forever? And why had she been taken from them? There were so many unanswered questions, and Claire felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure of what awaited her on the other side. The next morning, the tension in the mansion was palpable. Claire could feel it from the moment she stepped out of her room. The staff moved quietly, sensing something was amiss. James barely spoke to her, his usual sharpness replaced by a wary silence. Claire couldn't help but wonder if he knew what was happening, if he, too, suspected that she might be connected to the family's past. As she moved through her tasks, her mind kept drifting back to the conversation with Mr. Smith. She tried to focus, but the questions gnawed at her. How could she find out the truth? She had spent her entire life not knowing who she really was, and now that the answers seemed within reach, the uncertainty was almost unbearable. By mid-morning, as Claire was preparing the dining room for lunch, Michael entered the room. His presence sent a ripple of tension through her, and she could feel his eyes on her as she arranged the silverware. He hadn't spoken to her since their conversation in the garden the day before, but she knew he was just as consumed by the question as she was. "Claire," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She looked up, meeting his gaze. His face was pale, his expression strained, as if he had spent the night grappling with his own thoughts. "We need to take the next step," he continued. "I've arranged for a private investigator to look into your past. I need to know if you're truly my daughter." Claire's heart raced at his words. The idea of someone investigating her past, digging into the mystery of her life, filled her with both hope and fear. What if they found something? What if they found nothing? What if she wasn't their daughter after all? "I understand," she replied softly, though her voice trembled slightly. "I want to be clear," Michael said, stepping closer. "If you are my daughter, Claire, this will change everything. But we need to be sure. We can't jump to conclusions based on a locket alone." Claire nodded, though her mind was racing. The locket, the one symbol of her identity, might hold the key to unlocking the truth, but it was just a piece of the puzzle. "I'll cooperate however I can," she said, her voice steadier now. "I want to know the truth too." Michael gave her a long, searching look, as if trying to see the daughter he lost in the young woman standing before him. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving Claire standing alone in the quiet dining room, her mind spinning. Later that day, while Claire was folding linens in the laundry room, she found herself thinking about Mrs. Smith. Sarah had been noticeably absent from the conversation about the locket, and Claire wondered what she thought of all this. Surely Michael must have told her about his suspicions, about the possibility that Claire was their daughter, but Mrs. Smith had remained distant, as if she were avoiding the entire situation. Claire had always sensed a deep sadness in Mrs. Smith, something beyond the usual sorrow of loss. There was a heaviness in the way she moved through the house, a weight she carried with her wherever she went. Claire wondered if the idea that she might be their daughter was too much for Mrs. Smith to bear, if the possibility of reopening old wounds had pushed her deeper into isolation. As Claire finished folding the last of the linens, she made a decision. She needed to speak to Mrs. Smith to hear her side of things. Maybe it would give her some clarity, or at least help her understand the weight of the situation. That evening, after dinner had been served and the household had quieted down, Claire made her way to the second floor, where Mrs. Smith's private sitting room was located. She had never ventured up here before. It was strictly off-limits for the staff unless specifically requested. But tonight, she felt compelled to reach out. Her heart pounded as she approached the door. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should knock, unsure if she even had the right to intrude. But before she could second-guess herself, she raised her hand and gently knocked on the door. A soft voice from inside responded, "Come in." Claire slowly opened the door and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with a single lamp casting a soft glow over the space. Mrs. Smith was sitting by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes gazing out into the dark garden below. "Mrs. Smith," Claire began quietly, unsure of how to proceed. I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to speak with you." Mrs. Smith didn't turn to face her, but she didn't ask her to leave either. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "What is it, Claire?" Claire took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I know that Mr. Smith told you about his suspicions, about the locket. I just wanted to know how you feel about all of this." Mrs. Smith was silent for a moment, and when she finally turned to look at Claire, her eyes were filled with sorrow. "How do I feel?" she repeated softly, almost as if asking herself the question. I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, Claire. Part of me wants to believe that you could be our daughter, that after all these years, she's finally come back to us. But the other part of me," she trailed off, her voice breaking slightly. Claire waited, her heart heavy with the weight of Mrs. Smith's emotions. "The other part of me is terrified," Mrs. Smith continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Terrified that this is all just another false hope, another wound waiting to be opened. We've been down this road before, Claire. We've searched for her, we've hoped, and every time we've been left with nothing but more pain." Claire felt a lump rise in her throat. She had never considered the possibility that the Smiths had been through this before, that they had experienced false hope and crushing disappointment in their search for their daughter. "I don't want to hurt you," Claire said softly. "I just want to know the truth." Mrs. Smith nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "So do I, Claire, so do I." The two women sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their shared uncertainty hanging between them like a cloud. Neither of them knew what the future held, but in that moment they both understood the pain of not knowing, the agony of being caught between hope and fear. The following days at the Smith mansion felt like an uneasy waiting game. Claire moved through her duties with a new sense of purpose, but also an underlying tension she couldn't shake. Michael Smith had hired a private investigator to dig into her past, and the thought of someone uncovering details about her life that even she didn't know was unsettling. The weight of the unknown pressed on her constantly. Despite the turmoil inside, she maintained her composure around the staff, especially James, whose icy demeanor had not thawed in the slightest. He continued to observe her closely, his watchful eyes making it clear that he was still skeptical of her presence in the mansion. Claire sensed that he knew more than he let on, but whatever his suspicions were, he kept them tightly guarded. One evening, as Claire was clearing the dining room after dinner, Michael approached her. His face was drawn, the dark circles under his eyes betraying his lack of sleep. The investigation was taking its toll on him. That much was clear. "Claire," he said, his voice heavy, "the investigator, David, has started looking into your history. We should have some answers soon." Claire's heart raced. She had known this was coming, but hearing it confirmed sent a rush of anxiety through her. What if the investigation revealed something she wasn't prepared for? What if it proved she wasn't their daughter after all? "Do you think he'll find anything?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I have to believe we're getting closer to the truth." He looked up, meeting her eyes with a mixture of hope and fear. "Whatever happens, Claire, I want you to know that this isn't just about the locket. It's about the feeling I have, the connection. I can't explain it, but I need to follow this through. For my wife, for myself." Claire nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. She could see how much this was affecting Michael, how deeply he wanted to believe that she was his lost daughter. The weight of his hope was both comforting and terrifying. She wanted to be the person they were looking for, but what if she wasn't? "I understand," she replied softly. "I want to know too." Michael gave her a small, sad smile. "We'll find out soon enough." The following week passed in a haze of tension and uncertainty. The investigator, David, had begun contacting people from Claire's past, the orphanage where she was raised, the social workers who had been involved in her case. Every day that passed felt like it brought them closer to an answer, but the waiting was agonizing. Claire continued her work as usual, but the atmosphere in the mansion had shifted. The other staff were polite but distant, as if they sensed that something significant was happening behind the scenes. Clara, the head housekeeper, seemed to know more than she let on, but she kept her interactions with Claire strictly professional, offering no insight into what the family might be thinking. It was clear that Sarah Smith was struggling with the situation. Since their conversation in the sitting room, Mrs. Smith had become even more withdrawn, barely leaving her quarters. Claire hadn't seen her in days, and she couldn't help but worry that the stress of the investigation was taking a toll on her health. One afternoon, as Claire was tidying up the library, she overheard a hushed conversation between Michael and Robert, the family lawyer. They were in Michael's study, the door slightly ajar, and their voices carried just enough for her to catch snippets of their conversation. "I'm not sure what to make of it," Robert was saying, his voice low and cautious. "The investigator has found some discrepancies." Claire's heart skipped a beat. Discrepancies? What did that mean? "What kind of discrepancies?" Michael asked, his tone tense. "There are gaps in the records from the orphanage," Robert explained. "David's having trouble finding concrete documentation of Claire's time there. Some files are missing, and there are conflicting accounts of when she was first admitted." Claire froze, her mind racing. Missing files, conflicting accounts. This was the first time she had heard anything like this. She had always assumed her records were complete, that her past had been thoroughly documented, even if it was filled with unknowns. But now, it seemed like there were pieces of her story that didn't fit. "How is that possible?" Michael asked, frustration evident in his voice. "It's not uncommon for orphanages from that time to have incomplete records," Robert replied. "But it raises questions. David is still digging, but it's going to take time to piece everything together." Michael let out a heavy sigh. "I just want answers, Robert. We've waited so long." "I know," Robert said gently. "But we have to be patient. Rushing this won't give us the truth." Claire quickly moved away from the door before she could hear more. Her mind was spinning. Missing files, conflicting accounts. Could it mean there was something more to her story than she had ever known? That evening, Claire sat alone in the garden, her usual place of refuge. The soft sound of the fountain helped calm her nerves, but her mind was still racing. She had spent her entire life accepting that she was an orphan, that her past was a mystery she would never fully understand. But now it seemed like there were secrets even she hadn't been aware of. The possibility that her records were incomplete, that there were missing pieces to her history, terrified her. What if she had been taken from the Smiths, as Michael suspected? What if the reason no one had found her all those years ago was because someone had intentionally erased parts of her past? The idea was too overwhelming to fully grasp. Claire had always longed for a family, for answers, but now that she was on the brink of discovering the truth, she wasn't sure if she was ready for what it might reveal. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up to see James standing nearby, his expression as cold and unreadable as ever. "You've been spending a lot of time out here," he remarked, his tone as sharp as usual. Claire stood up, feeling a surge of defensiveness rise within her. "It's the only place I can think," she replied evenly, "away from everything else." James raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking briefly to the locket around her neck. You think being out here will help you figure out who you are? Claire's jaw tightened. What does that mean? James took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. You think you belong here, don't you? That you're their long-lost daughter. Come back to save them from their misery. Claire felt her anger flare. I never said that. No, but it's clear you want it to be true, James said, his voice cold and biting. But let me tell you something, Claire. This family has been through enough. They don't need false hope, and they certainly don't need you playing into their delusions. Claire's hands clenched into fists at her sides. I'm not playing into anything. I'm just trying to figure out the truth. James stared at her for a long moment, his expression hard and unforgiving. I've seen people like you before. People who think they can waltz into someone's life and fix everything, but it's not that simple. You don't know what you're getting into. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Claire standing alone in the garden, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and confusion. She wanted to shout after him, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat back down on the bench, her mind racing with everything James had said. He didn't believe her. He didn't believe she could be the Smith's daughter. And part of Claire feared he might be right. What if this was all just false hope? What if the investigation only led to more disappointment? But despite her doubts, Claire knew one thing for certain. She needed to see this through. She needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The days continued to drag on, each one feeling longer than the last. Claire could hardly focus on her work as the investigation into her past unfolded. Every task she completed was done on autopilot, washing dishes, polishing silver, dusting the endless rows of books in the Smith's Grand Library, while her thoughts remained consumed by what the private investigator might find. She felt as though she were living in limbo, caught between two worlds, the one she had always known, and this new reality that might be waiting for her, one tied to a family she had never imagined. Then, one afternoon, just as Claire was finishing up in the kitchen, Michael Smith approached her, his face tense yet determined. There was a weight to his presence, a seriousness that Claire immediately noticed. Claire, he began, his voice low but steady, I've just received some news from the investigator, David. I think it's time we sit down and talk. Her heart leapt into her throat. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear what he had to say, but she nodded, wiping her hands on her apron before following him to the study. The study was as imposing as ever, filled with dark wood, tall bookshelves, and the faint smell of leather and old paper. Michael motioned for Claire to sit in one of the armchairs near the window, while he took a seat behind his large oak desk. For a long moment, he said nothing, his gaze drifting out the window toward the garden, where the late afternoon sun cast a soft golden light. Finally, he turned his attention back to Claire, his eyes serious. David's been working around the clock to piece together your history, he began. He's spoken with the orphanage, tracked down social workers, and sifted through as many records as he could find. Claire clenched her hands in her lap, her pulse quickening. This is it. There are inconsistencies, Michael continued, his voice carefully measured. As I told you before, some of the records from the orphanage are missing, and the ones that do exist raise more questions than answers. Claire's throat went dry. What kind of questions? Michael leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. For one, there's no definitive record of when you were first brought to the orphanage. The earliest documents they have show you were found in a park when you were about 2 years old, but beyond that, things get murky. The records don't align with what we've been told. There's no clear chain of events leading from the day you were found to the day you were placed at the orphanage. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She had always believed the story she'd been told, that she was a lost child with no family, no history, but now it seemed like that story might not be the whole truth. David also found something else, Michael added, his voice growing more intense. The location where you were found, it matches the park where my daughter was last seen. Claire's heart pounded. The same park. Michael nodded, It can't be a coincidence, Claire. The dates, the place, it all lines up. Claire felt a wave of emotion crash over her. Could it really be true? Could she be the Smiths' lost daughter, taken from them all those years ago and placed in an orphanage without any trace of her real identity? I don't understand, Claire said softly, her voice shaking. How could that happen? Why wasn't I found sooner? That's what we're trying to figure out, Michael said, his expression hardening. There's still so much we don't know, but we're getting closer to the truth. David is going to keep digging, but right now, everything points to the possibility that you are our daughter. Claire's mind spun with the weight of his words. It felt impossible to comprehend. Could she really be the child they had lost all those years ago? The child they had searched for, grieved for? And if so, why had she been placed in an orphanage with no one looking for her? Michael, she began, her voice trembling. If I am your daughter, why didn't anyone find me before? Why was I left in that park? Michael's jaw tightened, and he leaned back in his chair, his eyes clouded with emotion. That's the question that haunts me, Claire. If you really are our daughter, then someone took you from us, and I need to know why. Claire stared at him, her mind racing. Someone took me from them. The thought was terrifying. She had always assumed she had simply been lost, that her parents had either abandoned her or died, but now, the idea that she had been taken, that someone had deliberately separated her from her family, was almost too much to bear. What do we do now? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We wait for David to finish his investigation, Michael said, though his tone betrayed his frustration at having to wait. But in the meantime, I want you to take a DNA test. Claire's breath caught. Of course, a DNA test would confirm, once and for all, whether or not she was truly their daughter. The science would give them the answers they needed, with no room for doubt. I'll do it, Claire said firmly, though inside she was trembling. Michael nodded, relief washing over his features. Thank you. We'll arrange for it as soon as possible. The days that followed were filled with a nervous anticipation that seemed to grip the entire household. Claire went through the motions of her duties, but her mind was elsewhere, consumed by the prospect of the DNA test. The simple swab had been taken in the privacy of her room, a painless procedure that held the power to change her entire life. Now, all she could do was wait for the results. The tension in the mansion was palpable. Sarah Smith had barely left her room, and whenever Claire passed by her quarters, she could hear the soft murmur of voices, Mrs. Smith talking to herself, or perhaps on the phone with friends or family, struggling to cope with the emotional toll the investigation was taking on her. James, ever the stoic butler, remained as cold and distant as ever. He said nothing about the DNA test, but Claire could feel his disapproval in every glance he sent her way. He didn't believe she was their daughter, that much was clear. But why? Was it simply that he didn't want to see the family get their hopes up? Or was there something more? One evening, as Claire was preparing to retire for the night, she found herself once again drawn to the garden. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the suffocating tension inside the mansion, and she made her way to her usual spot near the fountain. The soft sound of the water soothed her, but her thoughts were still restless. She had never imagined her life would take such a turn. Just weeks ago, she had been a simple maid, starting a new job in a grand house, with no expectations beyond doing her work and earning her keep. Now, she stood on the edge of a revelation that could change everything. If the DNA test came back positive, she would no longer be just Claire. She would be the Smith's daughter, part of a family she had never known. But what if the test came back negative? What if, after all the hope and anticipation, she wasn't their daughter? The thought sent a wave of dread through her. She had grown to care for the Smiths, despite the distance and the tension. She didn't want to hurt them, but she also didn't want to be the source of their heartbreak. As she sat on the stone bench, staring into the rippling water of the fountain, she heard a soft voice behind her. "Claire!" She turned to see Sarah Smith standing a few feet away, her face pale in the dim light of the garden lamps. There was something fragile about her, as if she were holding herself together by sheer will. "I couldn't sleep," Mrs. Smith said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I've been thinking about everything." Claire stood, unsure of what to say. "I want you to know," Sarah continued, stepping closer, "that no matter what happens, no matter what the DNA test says, you're part of this family now. We've been through too much already, and I don't want to lose you too." Tears welled in Claire's eyes. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected Mrs. Smith to offer her acceptance before they even knew the results. "I don't know what to say," Claire whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Sarah smiled weakly, her eyes glistening. "Just stay with us." The following days felt like a blur. Claire continued her routine, but the tension in the mansion had reached a palpable level. The DNA test had been taken, and now everyone in the household seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the results that could change everything. Every time Claire crossed paths with Michael or Sarah, she could see the strain in their faces. Michael remained steadfast, though his anxiety was clear in the way he paced around the mansion, often disappearing into his study for hours at a time. Sarah, on the other hand, had grown more fragile. She rarely left her room, and when she did, her movements were slow, deliberate, as though every step weighed heavily on her. The emotional toll of waiting for the truth was breaking her. For Claire, the waiting was torturous. Every day felt like a countdown to an answer she wasn't sure she was ready for. She had no family, no real past. And for so long, the locket had been her only connection to an unknown world. Now, the possibility that this unknown world was about to become her reality was both exhilarating and terrifying. What if I really am their daughter? The question played over and over in her mind, each time with a different emotion attached: hope, fear, excitement, doubt. The staff, too, seemed to sense that something monumental was happening. James, always vigilant and distant, watched her with a mix of suspicion and quiet disapproval. Though he never voiced his thoughts outright, Claire could feel his distrust every time he was near her. Clara, the head housekeeper, was more discreet, offering kind words in passing but never prying into the family's affairs. It was clear that everyone was waiting, silently bracing for the outcome of the DNA test. One evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, Michael called Claire to his study. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that the results of the test could come at any time, but she wasn't prepared for how sudden it would feel. Her heart pounded as she walked down the long corridor to his office, her mind racing with possibilities. When she entered the room, Michael was standing by the window, staring out at the garden with his back to her. The air in the study was thick with tension, and Claire could feel the weight of what was about to be said. She stood near the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, waiting for him to speak. After what felt like an eternity, Michael turned to face her, his expression solemn. In his hand, he held an envelope. The results. "We have the answer," he said quietly, his voice filled with both anticipation and dread. Claire swallowed hard, her heart thudding in her chest. She didn't dare move, her feet rooted to the floor as her mind raced. "This is it." Michael took a deep breath, then slowly opened the envelope. He pulled out the paper inside and unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words in front of him. The silence stretched on, heavy and unbearable, until finally Michael looked up, his face unreadable. "It's positive," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're our daughter." Claire's breath caught in her throat, her mind struggling to process the words. "I'm their daughter." The reality of it hit her all at once, like a wave crashing over her. She had spent her whole life not knowing where she came from, and now, in an instant, everything had changed. She didn't know whether to feel joy or fear. The emotions inside her were too tangled, too overwhelming to make sense of. She was their daughter, the child they had lost, the one they had grieved for all these years. But what did that mean for her? Who was she "I don't know what to say," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. I I never imagined. Michael crossed the room and stood in front of her, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and relief. We've waited so long for this, he said softly. All these years, we never gave up hope, and now you're here. Tears welled up in Claire's eyes, and she quickly wiped them away. I don't even remember, she said, her voice breaking. I don't remember being your daughter. I don't remember anything from before. It doesn't matter, Michael said gently. You're here now. That's all that matters. Claire nodded, though the weight of the moment felt too heavy to fully understand. She was overwhelmed with emotion, grief for the years lost, fear of what the future held, and a deep, aching hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found the family she had always longed for. The news spread quickly through the household. By the time Claire returned to her room, everyone knew the results of the DNA test. She could feel the shift in the air, the quiet whispers among the staff, the way people looked at her with a new kind of curiosity. Even James, who had been so cold and distant, now seemed unsure of how to act around her. That night, as Claire lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she felt an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. She had spent her entire life thinking of herself as an orphan, with no family, no roots. Now, everything had changed. She had parents, a family, a history that had been hidden from her for so long, but it also meant stepping into a life she didn't know, a life she wasn't sure she was ready for. What would it mean to be Claire Smith, the daughter of Michael and Sarah Smith? Could she truly fill the void that had been left in their lives all those years ago? And more than that, who had taken her from them in the first place? As these thoughts swirled in her mind, Claire realized that while the DNA test had provided one answer, it had also opened the door to a whole new set of questions. The mystery of her disappearance still loomed large. Someone had taken her from the Smiths, and for what purpose? Why had she been left in a park with no trace of her identity? The locket was the only clue, but it wasn't enough. There had to be more, and there was still James. His reaction to the news had been strangely muted, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. He had been with the Smith family for years, long before she had ever arrived. Could he know something about what had happened to her? The next morning, as Claire sat quietly in the garden, Sarah Smith approached her. There was a softness in her expression, a vulnerability that Claire hadn't seen before. I heard the news, Sarah said softly, sitting down beside Claire on the stone bench. I can't even begin to tell you how much this means to me. To us. Claire looked at her, unsure of how to respond. I don't know what to feel, she admitted quietly. It's all so overwhelming. Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. I can only imagine. You've been through so much, and now everything is changing so quickly. There was a long pause as both women sat in silence, the sound of the fountain bubbling softly in the background. Finally, Sarah reached out and gently took Claire's hand. You're part of this family, Claire, she said, her voice filled with emotion. I know it's hard to accept, and I know you don't have any memories of us, but that doesn't change the fact that we're your parents. We love you. Tears welled up in Claire's eyes once again, and she squeezed Sarah's hand. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I want to be part of this family. I really do, but I'm still so confused. There's so much I don't know. Sarah nodded, her expression serious. I know. There are still so many unanswered questions about what happened to you, how you were taken from us, but we'll figure it out, together. Claire looked at her, her heart filled with both hope and uncertainty. She had spent so long searching for answers, and now that she had found her family, there was still a part of her that felt lost. The truth about her past was out there, somewhere, and she wouldn't rest until she uncovered it. The days following the revelation of the DNA test were surreal for Claire. She had gone from being the orphaned maid in the Smith household to being their long-lost daughter in a matter of weeks. The identity she had known all her life had been shattered and rebuilt into something new, something she was still struggling to comprehend. As much as she wanted to embrace the Smiths as her family, the emotional turbulence inside her was overwhelming. While the DNA test had confirmed what Michael and Sarah Smith had hoped for, it didn't answer the deeper questions, the ones that haunted Claire. Who took her? Why was she left in that park? And most importantly, how had her identity been hidden for so long? The tension in the house remained thick, but it had shifted in nature. The entire household was adjusting to the news, and Claire noticed the way the other staff members treated her now. The distance they once maintained had grown. She was no longer just one of them. The whispers had increased, and it became clear that everyone was trying to figure out how to treat the young woman who was no longer just a maid, but a member of the Smith family. The awkwardness was particularly evident with James, who seemed to be avoiding her as much as possible. Since the results of the DNA test, he had been quieter than usual, his gaze more calculating. There was something about his behavior that unnerved Claire. Every time she caught him watching her, she felt a prickle of unease. He wasn't angry, but there was something in his eyes, something that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that James held a piece of the puzzle she was trying to solve. One evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet after dinner, Claire found herself alone in the grand library. The flickering light from the fireplace cast long shadows across the room, and the rows of books seemed to stretch on endlessly, full of untold stories and forgotten secrets. Claire had often come to the library for a sense of calm, but tonight she felt restless. The mansion, for all its luxury, had become a prison of unanswered questions. As she paced along the shelves, her thoughts drifted back to the moment when Michael had handed her the DNA test results. The look of relief on his face had been palpable, as if he had finally found the missing piece of his life. But for Claire, the revelation had been far more complicated. She wanted to feel that same sense of belonging. But how could she when she didn't remember being part of their family? The years spent at the orphanage had shaped her in ways that the Smiths couldn't understand. Just as she was lost in her thoughts, the door creaked open and Michael stepped into the room. He had a serious expression, though not as heavy as the days leading up to the test. "Claire," he began, his voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking about the next steps." Claire turned to face him, her heart tightening. "Next steps? Yes. We've got the DNA confirmation, but we still don't know how you ended up in that park, or why it took us this long to find you," Michael said, his brow furrowing with concern. "David, the investigator, is still working on piecing together what happened after you were taken." Claire nodded, though the weight of his words pressed heavily on her. She had been dreading this conversation, because as much as she wanted answers, she was terrified of what they might find. The truth might not be a simple story of a lost child being found. It could be much darker, much more complicated than any of them had imagined. "Do you think he'll find something?" Claire asked quietly, her voice laced with uncertainty. Michael sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know, but I have to believe we're getting closer. We've waited so long for this. I just want to know what really happened." His words echoed the thoughts that had been swirling in Claire's mind for days. She wanted to know the truth as much as he did, but with that truth came fear. What if the answers were more painful than she could bear? The next morning, Claire awoke to a strange quietness in the house. It was as though the mansion itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next revelation to come. She could feel it in every step she took, every glance from the staff. It was the calm before the storm. Claire spent most of the day in her room, sorting through her thoughts. Her mind kept going back to the locket. It had been the key to everything, the single link between her old life and her new one, and yet it was still a mystery. Who had given it to her? Why had it been the only thing left with her in that park? She had to know more. That afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Claire gathered the courage to confront the one person who might have more answers than he was willing to share. James. She found him in the hallway near the kitchen, going over the staff schedule for the week. "James," she said softly, stepping closer to him. He glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What is it, Miss Claire?" The way he said her name made her stomach churn. There was an edge to his voice that hadn't been there before, as though her new status in the family had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite hide. "I wanted to ask you something," Claire began, her voice steady but laced with tension. "About when I first arrived here." James straightened, his expression hardening. "What about it? Did you know? Did you suspect that I might be their daughter?" For a moment, James didn't respond. He simply stared at her, his eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "I didn't know anything for sure," he said coldly, "but I had my suspicions when I saw the locket. It was too much of a coincidence." "Why didn't you say something?" Claire pressed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "You knew the family had lost a daughter. You knew what that locket meant to them." James's gaze darkened, and for the first time, Claire saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or perhaps it was guilt. "I didn't think it was my place," he said sharply. "It's not my job to interfere with the family's affairs." Claire took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "But you've been with them for years. You must have known something was wrong." James's jaw tightened. "I didn't know anything concrete, and I wasn't going to fill their heads with false hope." Claire stared at him, her heart racing. His words were clipped, but there was something behind them, something he wasn't saying. "Is there more you're not telling me?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. James's eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps. But before he could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and they both turned to see David, the private investigator, approaching them. "Claire!" David called out, his expression grim. "I've found something. You'll want to hear this." The weight of David's words hung in the air as he led Claire and Michael into the study. The tension was palpable, and Claire could feel her heart pounding in her chest as they sat down around the large oak desk. David spread out a series of papers in front of them, his face serious. "I've been digging deeper into the records," David began, his voice steady but laced with gravity. "And I've uncovered some troubling information." Claire held her breath as David continued. "There were inconsistencies in the orphanage's paperwork, as I mentioned before. But it's more than just missing files. There's evidence that someone deliberately altered the records." Michael frowned, leaning forward. "Altered how?" David met his gaze. "It seems that shortly after Claire was found in the park, someone tampered with her identity. Her name, her date of birth, everything was changed. It's as if someone didn't want her to be traced back to her real family." Claire felt a cold chill run down her spine. But who would do that? Why? David's expression darkened. "That's what we're trying to figure out. But whoever did this went to great lengths to ensure she couldn't be found." Michael's face tightened with anger, and Claire could see the pain in his eyes. He had spent years searching for his daughter, and now it seemed that someone had intentionally kept them apart. "I'll keep digging," David said firmly. "We're not done yet." Claire nodded, though her mind was reeling. The truth was closer than ever, but it was more complicated and more terrifying than she had imagined. The revelations from David, the investigator, had shaken the foundation of everything Claire thought she knew. The idea that someone had tampered with her identity was terrifying. It was no longer just a story of a lost child found in a park. It was much darker than that. Someone had intentionally hidden her, altered her name, her birth date, and every detail that could have led her back to her real family. Why? That question haunted her more than anything. The tension in the Smith mansion was heavier than ever. Claire could feel it with every glance from Michael and every worried look from Sarah. The mystery was no longer just about finding her family. It was about discovering who had wanted to keep her hidden and why they went to such lengths. Michael had grown quieter since David's revelation. He spent long hours in his study, going over the investigator's findings and trying to piece together the fragmented clues. Claire had seen him pacing late at night, his face lined with worry. Sarah, on the other hand, had become more emotionally fragile, The stress of it all was wearing her down, and she often stayed in her room, retreating into herself. It was clear that the thought of someone deliberately stealing their daughter was almost too much for her to bear. For Claire, the uncertainty was agonizing. She had only just begun to accept the idea of being part of this family, and now, with the possibility of foul play, it felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet again. She had never known who she really was, and now, the few answers she had were being overshadowed by darker questions. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Claire found herself once again drawn to the quiet of the garden. The cool night air provided a much-needed sense of calm, though it did little to ease the turmoil in her mind. She sat on the stone bench near the fountain, staring at the water as it rippled in the dim light. Her fingers absently played with the locket around her neck, the one thing that had always been a constant in her life. The locket had been the key to unlocking her past, but now it felt like a symbol of everything that had been hidden from her. Who had given it to her? And why had she been left with it? As she sat there, lost in thought, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see James approaching, his expression as unreadable as ever. Claire tensed. Ever since David's discovery, she had been increasingly suspicious of James. He had been with the Smith family for years. He had to know something, and yet he remained distant, cold, and unhelpful. "Couldn't sleep?" James asked, his voice as sharp as ever. Claire shook her head. "There's too much on my mind." James nodded, though his expression remained neutral. "That's understandable." For a moment, there was only silence between them, the quiet hum of the fountain filling the space. Claire debated whether or not to confront him, to ask him outright what he knew. She had held back for days, but now, with the mystery deepening, she couldn't wait any longer. "James," she began, her voice steady but tense, "do you know more about what happened to me than you're letting on?" James's eyes flickered, but his face remained impassive. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Claire said, her voice growing firmer, "that you've been with this family for a long time, long enough to know things that others don't. You've been avoiding me ever since the DNA test results came back, and now that we know someone tampered with my records, I think you're hiding something." For the first time, Claire saw a crack in James's stoic demeanor. His jaw tightened, and his gaze shifted away from hers. He was silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "You don't know what you're asking, Claire," he said quietly. "This is more complicated than you think." Claire's heart raced. "More complicated? What was he talking about?" "Then explain it to me," she pressed. "I deserve to know the truth." James hesitated again, his expression conflicted. Claire could see the struggle in his eyes, the internal battle he was fighting. Finally, he sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I've been with the Smith family for a long time," he began, his voice low. "Long enough to see things that I wish I hadn't. When you went missing, it nearly destroyed them. They searched for you everywhere, hired the best detectives, but no one could find you. After a while, they had to accept that you were gone." Claire swallowed hard, her throat tightening with emotion. She had always known that her disappearance had been painful for the Smiths, but hearing it from someone who had been there, who had witnessed it firsthand, made it all the more real. "But what does that have to do with my records being tampered with?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James's expression darkened. "There were people who didn't want you to be found, Claire. People who had a vested interest in keeping you away from this family." Claire's breath caught. "People? Who? Who would do that?" she asked, her voice trembling. James shook his head. "I don't know exactly who, but I have my suspicions. There are things about this family, secrets that go back years. When you disappeared, it wasn't just a random act. Someone took you, and they went to great lengths to make sure you stayed hidden." Claire stared at him, her mind reeling. "Someone took me." The thought was horrifying. She had spent her entire life believing she had simply been abandoned or lost. But now, the reality was much darker. Someone had stolen her, and they had done everything in their power to keep her from being found. "Why?" she whispered, her voice shaky. Why would anyone do that? I don't know, James said softly. But whoever it was, they're dangerous, and they're still out there. Claire's stomach turned. The idea that someone had taken her, and that they might still be out there watching, was too much to bear. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the truth. She had to know more. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steadying as she spoke. James looked at her, his expression serious. "We wait for David to finish his investigation. He's close to uncovering something, I can feel it. But until then, you need to be careful, Claire. There are people who won't want the truth to come out." The following days were tense, each one filled with a sense of dread, as Claire waited for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. Michael and Sarah were growing more anxious by the day, and the atmosphere in the mansion had become thick with fear and uncertainty. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she stepped outside, every time she moved through the house, she felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as if someone was following her every move. She had no proof, of course, but the fear was real. David continued his investigation, digging deeper into the altered records and the people who might have been involved. He had uncovered several suspicious leads, but nothing concrete yet. Whoever had orchestrated her disappearance had done a thorough job of covering their tracks. One evening, as Claire sat in her room, she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Michael standing there, his face lined with worry. "Can I come in?" he asked softly. Claire nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. He sat down on the edge of her bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "about everything that's happened, about how we've finally found you, but how nothing feels resolved. I thought finding you would be the end of the search, but now I realize it's just the beginning." Claire sat beside him, her heart aching for him and for the pain he had carried all these years. "I don't know who did this to you, Claire," Michael continued, his voice trembling slightly, "but I promise you we will find out. No matter how long it takes, no matter what we have to do, we'll get to the bottom of this." Claire nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. She had never felt more connected to Michael than in that moment. Despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, she knew one thing for sure. This was her family, and they would stand by her no matter what. The tension inside the Smith mansion had reached a breaking point. It had been days since David, the private investigator, had revealed the troubling information about Claire's altered records, and each passing moment only deepened the mystery. Claire felt like her entire existence was unraveling. She knew she was Michael and Sarah Smith's daughter, but the questions of how she had been taken and why her identity had been hidden for so long consumed her thoughts. Michael had doubled his efforts to push David for answers, but progress was slow. The investigator had been following every lead, reaching out to contacts, digging through old files, and trying to uncover the truth. The revelation that someone had altered Claire's identity was shocking enough, but now it seemed like the person responsible had gone to great lengths to ensure she would never be found. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the mansion's vast gardens, Michael gathered the family in the study. His face was tense, his expression betraying the toll this search was taking on him. Claire, seated beside Sarah, could feel the weight of what was about to be said. "David has found something new," Michael began, his voice thick with emotion. He hesitated, glancing at Sarah, who nodded for him to continue. "It's not conclusive yet, but it's important. He's discovered a connection, someone who might have been involved in your disappearance, Claire." Claire's heart skipped a beat. She sat up straighter, her pulse quickening. "A connection? Who is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael sighed, rubbing his forehead. "David traced some of the missing records to a former employee of the orphanage where you were placed, a woman named Margaret Wills. She worked there during the time you were brought in." Claire frowned, the name unfamiliar to her. "Who is she?" "She left the orphanage shortly after you were admitted," Michael explained. "But according to some of the records David uncovered, she had a hand in processing the paperwork for new arrivals. The timeline matches, and there's evidence that she might have altered some of the files. Claire's stomach twisted. Why would she do that? That's what we're trying to find out, Michael said, his voice grim. David is tracking her down now. She left the city years ago, but we're close to finding her. Sarah reached out, taking Claire's hand. We're going to get to the bottom of this, she said softly, her eyes filled with determination. Claire nodded, though her mind was racing. Margaret Wills. The name meant nothing to her, but it was clear this woman held a key piece of the puzzle. If she had tampered with Claire's records, she might know why she was taken from the Smiths and who was behind it. Over the next few days, Claire tried to focus on her daily routine, but her mind was consumed by the looming confrontation with Margaret. She could sense the tension in the household growing, especially around James. The butler had grown even more distant since the news about Margaret had come to light. He moved quietly through the mansion, avoiding Claire's gaze and keeping to himself more than usual. One afternoon, as Claire was tidying the sitting room, she found herself alone with James. The silence between them was heavy, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. Ever since the investigation had begun, James had been acting strangely, and his reluctance to engage with her was becoming more pronounced. Taking a deep breath, Claire decided she couldn't keep avoiding the question that had been gnawing at her for days. She turned to face him, her hands trembling slightly. "James," she began, her voice steady, despite the nervousness she felt. "I need to ask you something." James paused in his work, his expression tightening. "What is it?" Claire swallowed hard. "Do you know anything about Margaret Wills, the woman who worked at the orphanage when I was brought in?" For a moment, James didn't answer. His face remained impassive, but Claire saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew the name. He knew something. "I don't see how that's relevant to me," James said finally, his tone clipped. "It's relevant because we're close to finding out what happened to me," Claire said, her voice firm. "And I think you know more than you're telling me." James's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, Claire thought he might walk away without answering. But then, to her surprise, he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "There are things you don't understand, Claire," he said quietly, his voice lower now. "Things that happened years ago, things that are complicated." Claire's heart raced. "Then explain them to me. I deserve to know the truth." James hesitated, his eyes darting to the door as if he were afraid someone might overhear. Finally, he stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. "Margaret Wills, she wasn't just a worker at the orphanage," James said. "She had connections, powerful connections, people who could make things disappear, people who didn't want you to be found." Claire's blood ran cold. "Why? Why didn't they want me to be found?" James shook his head. "I don't know the full story. All I know is that when you went missing, things got complicated. There were people who stood to gain from you being gone, from keeping you out of your parents' lives." Claire's mind reeled. People who stood to gain. What could that mean? Who would benefit from her being taken away from her family? "Who?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Who would want me gone?" "I can't say for sure," James said, his tone grim. "But Margaret had ties to some very dangerous people, people who had interests in the Smith family's business dealings. It's possible that your disappearance was part of a much larger plan." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. The idea that her kidnapping could have been orchestrated for financial or political gain was horrifying. She had always thought of herself as an ordinary girl with no real importance. But now it seemed that her life had been entangled in something far more sinister. Before she could press James further, there was a knock at the door. They both turned to see Michael standing in the doorway, his face pale but determined. "David's found Margaret Wills," he said, his voice tense. "She's agreed to meet with us." The drive to Margaret Wills's house was tense and silent. Claire sat in the back seat of the car with Michael and David, her heart racing as they sped through the city streets. The investigator had tracked Margaret to a small, run-down house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the kind of place Claire had imagined someone with powerful connections would live. But then again, nothing about this situation had been what she expected. When they arrived, the air was thick with anticipation. Claire could feel her pulse in her throat as they approached the house. David knocked on the door, and after a long, agonizing pause, it creaked open. A woman in her late 60s stood in the doorway, her face lined with age and worry. Her eyes, once sharp, were now clouded with something that looked like regret. "Margaret Wills?" David asked, his voice firm but respectful. The woman nodded slowly, her gaze flicking nervously between them. "You're here about the girl," she said quietly, her voice raspy with age. Claire's breath caught in her throat. "The girl, me. We're here for answers," Michael said, stepping forward, his voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "We need to know what happened to our daughter." Margaret's face paled, and for a moment it seemed like she might close the door and refuse to speak. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Come inside," she said softly. "There are things you need to know." Inside, the house was small and cluttered, with faded furniture and the smell of dust lingering in the air. Margaret led them to a cramped living room, where they all sat down in a tense silence. Claire couldn't take her eyes off the woman who might hold the answers to the mystery that had consumed her life. "I never wanted to get involved," Margaret began, her voice shaky. "But I didn't have a choice." "What do you mean?" Michael asked, his voice laced with anger. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I was approached by people, powerful people, who offered me money to keep quiet about certain things. They told me to alter your records, Claire, to make sure you couldn't be traced back to your family." Claire's stomach churned. "But why? Why would they do that?" Margaret shook her head. "It was all about control. Your family. They were involved in business dealings that made some very powerful enemies. Taking you away was a way to weaken them, to make them vulnerable." Claire's mind spun. Business dealings, enemies, none of this made sense. But it was clear that Margaret had been a pawn in a much larger game, one that had cost Claire her entire childhood. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know what else to do." The dim light inside Margaret Wills' home seemed to reflect the weight of the revelations that had just been shared. Claire sat on the edge of her seat, trying to process everything. Margaret's trembling voice still echoed in her mind. It was all about control, to weaken your family. It felt like her entire life had been caught in a web of manipulation and deceit, and the reality of it was suffocating. For years, Claire had believed her story was simple, a child lost in a park, left to grow up without a family. But now, it was clear that her disappearance had been anything but an accident. She had been stolen, her identity erased, and her family's suffering used as a tool in some greater scheme. It was too much to take in all at once. But Claire knew this conversation wasn't over. There were still more questions to ask, more truths to uncover. Michael, seated beside her, was visibly shaken. His fists were clenched tightly, his knuckles white as he struggled to contain his emotions. Sarah had remained at home, unable to face this confrontation, but Claire knew that the weight of these revelations would hit her just as hard. Michael's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely controlled. "Who were these people?" he asked, his voice trembling with anger. "Who paid you to take our daughter from us?" Margaret hesitated, her gaze falling to the floor. Her guilt was palpable, and Claire could see the burden of the past in the lines etched across her face. She had been a part of something dark, something that had torn a family apart, and now she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. "They weren't people you could just say no to," Margaret said quietly. "They were involved in powerful circles, business, politics. Your family, the Smiths, you had made enemies, powerful ones. I didn't ask questions. I was just told to alter the records, to make sure Claire couldn't be traced back to you. They gave me money, enough to keep me quiet, enough to make me disappear." Claire's breath caught. Business, politics, enemies. It was a world she had never been part of, but now it seemed her life had been shaped by forces far beyond her control. But there was still one piece missing, one part of the puzzle that she couldn't ignore. "Who gave the order?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "Who wanted me gone?" Margaret's eyes darted nervously, as if even now, years later, she was afraid to speak the name aloud. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she finally answered. "The man who paid me," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "His name was Arthur Reed. He worked with people who had interests in your father's business, people who wanted leverage over him. Taking you was part of their plan to destabilize your family. They thought it would force your father to make concessions, to give up control over certain deals." Michael stiffened at the mention of the name, Arthur Reed. It was a name he clearly recognized, and his reaction only confirmed that this man had been a threat to the Smith family for years. "I know Reed," Michael muttered darkly. "He's been involved in shady dealings for decades, but I never imagined he'd go this far." Claire's stomach churned. Her life had been collateral in some business feud she didn't understand, and the realization left her feeling hollow. How could anyone justify taking a child from her family for the sake of business interests? The sheer cruelty of it made her heart ache. "But why did they want me gone?" Claire pressed, her voice shaking. "Why not target my father directly?" Margaret sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her confession. "Reed believed that taking you would break your family, that it would make your father desperate, that he would do anything to get you back. And in a way, he was right. Your parents searched for years, and when they couldn't find you, it weakened them. Reed got what he wanted, a weakened Smith family that was easier to control." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes, and she felt a lump form in her throat. She had been used as a pawn in someone else's game, and her family had paid the price. She thought of her parents, of all the years they had spent grieving, searching, never giving up hope. And now, after all this time, the truth was finally coming to light. Michael's face was flushed with anger. "Reed will answer for this," he said through gritted teeth. "I'll make sure of it." David, the private investigator, who had been quietly taking in everything, finally spoke up. "I've been following Reed's trail since his name came up during the investigation. He's still involved in some questionable business dealings, but he's kept a low profile in recent years. If we dig deeper, we might be able to connect him to what happened to Claire." Michael nodded, his expression hardening. "Do whatever it takes. I want Reed held accountable for what he did." Claire's heart pounded. She wanted justice too. She wanted Reed to pay for what he had done to her family. But there was still so much she didn't understand. How had Reed managed to keep her hidden for so long? Why hadn't anyone discovered the truth sooner? As if reading her thoughts, Margaret spoke again, her voice heavy with guilt. "After I altered the records, I was told to leave the city. I went into hiding, but I always knew this day might come. I'm sorry, Claire, I truly am. I was just a pawn in all of this too." Claire wanted to be angry, wanted to shout at Margaret for being complicit in the scheme that had stolen her childhood, but as she looked at the broken woman before her, all she felt was sorrow. Margaret had made terrible choices, but she was not the mastermind behind the plan. Reed had been the true villain, manipulating everyone in his quest for power. "There's no going back," Claire said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I deserve to know everything. You said there were others involved. Who else?" Margaret hesitated, her eyes widening in fear. I don't know their names. Reed was the one who handled everything. I was just given instructions." Michael's face was hard as stone. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he said firmly. "We'll find everyone who was involved, and they will face justice." David nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll continue my investigation. We're getting closer, but it's clear that Reed and his associates went to great lengths to cover their tracks. We'll need time, but we'll get there." Claire nodded, though her heart still ached. The truth was coming to light, but it wasn't bringing the closure she had hoped for. There were still so many unanswered questions, and the more she learned, the darker the story became. That night, as they drove back to the mansion, the weight of the revelations hung heavy in the car. Michael was silent, his mind clearly consumed by thoughts of revenge and justice. Claire sat in the back seat, her mind swirling with everything she had just learned. She had spent her life believing she was forgotten, abandoned, lost. But now she knew the truth. She had been taken, her family had been torn apart, and it had all been part of a cruel game played by people who cared more about power than human lives. As they pulled up to the mansion, Claire felt a deep sense of resolve settle over her. She couldn't change the past, but she could fight for the future. She would stand by her family, and together they would bring those responsible to justice. But there was still one question that nagged at her, one question that kept her up late into the night. Why her? Out of all the ways to hurt her family, why had they chosen to take her? What made her so important to their plan? Claire knew there was more to this story, something deeper, something she hadn't uncovered yet. And until she found the final piece of the puzzle, she wouldn't rest. The ride back to the mansion after meeting with Margaret Wills was somber and tense. For Claire, the revelations had answered some questions but raised even more. Her life had been stolen, her family broken apart by the greed and ambition of powerful men like Arthur Reed. But the why behind it all still gnawed at her. She knew the plan had been to weaken the Smith family, but the personal nature of her kidnapping seemed to point to something deeper. Why her? Why go through so much effort to erase her from her own family's life? When they arrived back at the mansion, Michael was silent, but the determination in his eyes was unmistakable. He was no longer just searching for answers. Now, he was preparing for justice. Claire had never seen him like this, and she couldn't help but wonder how far he was willing to go to bring Arthur Reed and the people behind him to justice. Inside the house, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Sarah was waiting for them in the living room, her face pale but resolute. Claire saw the fear in her mother's eyes, the pain of knowing that their daughter had been used as a pawn in a larger game. But alongside the fear, there was also a fierce protectiveness, one that mirrored Michael's drive for justice. "What did you find out?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper as Michael and Claire sat down across from her. Michael exchanged a glance with Claire before he spoke. "We have a name," he said. "Arthur Reed." Sarah's face went white at the mention of the name, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the armrest of the chair. "Reed. I knew he was involved in some of the more underhanded dealings in our business circles, but this, taking our daughter," her voice cracked with emotion, the reality of the situation sinking in. "It wasn't just about business," Claire said quietly, feeling the weight of every word. "They wanted control over the family, and taking me was their way of weakening us." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back, her gaze hardening with resolve. "We have to stop him, Michael. We have to make sure he pays for what he did." Michael nodded, his jaw tight. "I've already told David to dig deeper into Reed's dealings. We know he's connected to some very powerful people, but if we can expose what he did to Claire, it could ruin him." Claire's heart pounded as she listened. Ruin him. The thought brought a strange sense of both relief and fear. She wanted justice, needed it even, but she was terrified of what might happen when they finally confronted Reed. He was dangerous, and if he had gone to such lengths to cover up her kidnapping, who knew what he was capable of? As if sensing her unease, Sarah reached out and took Claire's hand. "We're in this together," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "We won't let them get away with this. We'll fight for you." Claire nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. She had spent so many years feeling alone, disconnected from her past, but now, sitting here with her parents, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. They were a family, no matter what had happened in the past. Over the next few days, the mansion buzzed with a quiet intensity. David, the investigator, worked tirelessly, following leads and uncovering more about Reed's connections. The deeper he dug, the more it became clear that Reed's influence stretched far beyond business. He had connections to corrupt politicians, criminal enterprises, and a network of people willing to do anything for money and power. It was no wonder he had been able to orchestrate Claire's disappearance so successfully, but despite Reed's power, David was determined to bring him down. "We have enough to confront him," David told Michael one evening after a long day of investigating. "I've tracked some of the payments he made to Margaret Wills, and I've found evidence that ties him directly to the altered records at the orphanage. It's not enough for an arrest yet, but it's enough to force his hand." Michael nodded, his expression hardening. "Then it's time we confronted him." Claire's stomach churned at the thought of facing Reed. She had never met the man, but his presence had loomed over her entire life without her even knowing it. Now, the idea of standing face to face with the person who had stolen her from her family sent a wave of fear through her. But alongside the fear was a fierce determination. She wanted to see him brought to justice, not just for herself, but for her family. "I want to be there," Claire said, her voice steady. Michael looked at her, his expression softening for a moment. "Claire, you don't have to do this. I can handle it." But Claire shook her head. "No, I need to be there. I need to face him." Michael hesitated, but he saw the resolve in his daughter's eyes and finally nodded. "All right, but we'll be careful. Reed is dangerous." The next morning, Michael, Claire, and David prepared to confront Arthur Reed. David had arranged a meeting with Reed under the guise of discussing business, but they planned to reveal what they knew about Claire's kidnapping during the meeting. It was a risky plan, but it was the best chance they had of catching Reed off guard. The drive to Reed's office felt surreal. Claire sat in the back seat, her heart pounding with every mile. She had never imagined herself in this situation, about to confront the man who had orchestrated the disappearance that had defined her entire life. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew she had to be strong. When they arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. Reed's office was in a sleek, modern building in the heart of the city, far from the shadowy world in which he conducted his more questionable dealings. The lobby was pristine, the kind of place where high-powered deals were made. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the polished surface there was something rotten. David led the way, and they were soon ushered into Reed's private office. The man himself was seated behind a large desk, his sharp suit and calm demeanor betraying nothing of the darkness that lay beneath his exterior. His eyes flicked to Michael and Claire as they entered, but he showed no sign of recognition. "Michael," Reed said smoothly, standing to greet him. "I wasn't expecting you to bring company." Michael's expression remained hard as he introduced Claire. "This is my daughter, Claire, the daughter you had kidnapped." For a brief moment, Reed's mask slipped, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold, calculating expression of a man who was used to controlling every situation. "I don't know what you're talking about," Reed said calmly, though his eyes flicked nervously to David. "This sounds like a baseless accusation." David stepped forward, placing a folder of documents on Reed's desk. "We've got proof, Reed. Payments to Margaret Wills, altered records at the orphanage, all of it tied back to you. You can deny it all you want, but we're not leaving until you face the truth." Reed's jaw clenched as he opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. Claire watched him closely, her heart racing. She could see the cracks in his calm facade, the tension in his shoulders as he realized the evidence against him was real. For a long moment, there was silence. Then slowly, Reed closed the folder and looked up at them, his expression hard. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low. Michael stepped forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "I want you to admit what you did. I want you to tell my daughter why you took her from us." Reed's lips curled into a cold smile. "You think this was personal, Michael? It wasn't. It was business. You and your family were in the way, and I did what I had to do to gain the upper hand." Claire's stomach churned. Hearing him speak so casually about the crime that had torn her life apart made her feel sick, but she wasn't going to let him intimidate her. She stepped forward, her voice steady as she spoke. "You stole my life," she said quietly. "You took me from my family and tried to erase me, but you failed. I'm here now, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." Reed's eyes flicked to her, a flash of something like amusement crossing his face. "You think you can stop me?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is bigger than you, Claire, bigger than any of you." Michael stepped forward, his voice cold and dangerous. "We'll see about that." Arthur Reed's cold, smug expression burned in Claire's mind as she stood in his pristine office. The audacity with which he dismissed her kidnapping as just business twisted her stomach into knots. She had spent her entire life lost, stolen from her family, while this man casually played with lives like they were pieces in a game. But this was no game to Claire. As she stood there, looking into the eyes of the man responsible for her stolen childhood, she felt a surge of emotion, fear, anger, and determination mixed within her. She knew she couldn't let him continue to manipulate the situation. Reed's arrogance showed no sign of remorse, but Claire was no longer the lost girl she had been. She was a woman standing with her family, and she was ready to fight for the truth. Reed leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the wooden desk. His casual demeanor grated against the tension in the room. "You've got some nerve coming here with these accusations," he said, his voice calm but with a sharp edge. "Whatever you think you've uncovered, it won't change anything. Power like mine doesn't just disappear because of a few accusations." Michael, standing firm beside Claire, clenched his fists, his rage barely contained. "This isn't just about business anymore, Reed. This is personal. You destroyed our family, and now you're going to answer for it." Reed's smirk deepened, his confidence palpable. "You think you can touch me, Michael? You're not the man you once were. The Smith name doesn't carry the same weight it used to." David, the private investigator, stepped forward, his voice steady, but filled with authority. "We have more than just accusations. We have evidence, documents tying you to Claire's kidnapping, payments to Margaret Wills, falsified records at the orphanage. You can either admit your role in this now, or we'll take this to the authorities and let them deal with you." Reed's face hardened for the first time since they arrived. His eyes flicked toward the documents David had laid out on his desk, and for a moment, his confidence wavered. But then, just as quickly, he masked his uncertainty with a dismissive chuckle. "You think the authorities will listen to you? People like me? We're untouchable." Claire's voice cut through the tension, calm, but filled with resolve. "You're wrong. No one is untouchable, Reed. Not anymore." The room fell into a tense silence as Reed's eyes narrowed on her. For the first time, Claire saw a flicker of something that looked like uncertainty cross his face. He knew he was in trouble, but he wasn't willing to back down just yet. "What do you want?" Reed asked finally, his voice low, almost dangerous. Michael stepped forward, his voice filled with the weight of a father's anger. "I want you to admit what you did to my daughter. I want you to confess to everything, how you orchestrated her kidnapping, how you tried to erase her from our lives. And I want you to make sure everyone involved in this pays for what they did." Reed leaned back in his chair, a sneer creeping across his lips. "And if I don't, you think you can take me down?" Claire's heart pounded in her chest. The tension in the room was thick, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This confrontation was more than just a battle for justice. It was a reckoning. Everything she had lost, everything her family had suffered, was now hanging in the balance. David took a step forward, his expression cold. "We have enough to start legal proceedings, Reed. You can either cooperate now, or we'll make sure this story goes public. You'll lose everything, your reputation, your business, your power. It won't take long for people to turn on you once they see what you've done." Reed's face twisted with anger, and for a moment it looked like he might lash out. But then he stopped, his eyes narrowing as he considered his options. He knew David was right. The evidence against him was damning, and if it became public, it would destroy everything he had built. There was a long, tense pause before Reed finally spoke, his voice low and venomous. "Fine. You want the truth? Here it is. Claire's breath caught as she watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when Reed would finally admit to what he had done. "I orchestrated the kidnapping," Reed said, his eyes cold. "I paid Margaret Wills to alter the records, to ensure Claire couldn't be traced back to your family. It was all part of a larger plan to gain leverage over you, Michael. The Smith family had too much power, too much influence. Taking your daughter was the easiest way to destabilize you, to force you into making concessions." Michael's fists tightened at his sides, his rage barely contained. "And you ruined our lives in the process." Reed shrugged, his expression indifferent. "It was just business. I did what I had to do to survive." Claire felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Just business. Those two words echoed in her mind, a sickening reminder of how little her life had meant to this man. She had been nothing more than a pawn in his game, a tool to be used and discarded. David spoke again, his voice sharp. "Now that we have your confession, Reed, I suggest you start thinking about how you're going to make this right. We'll be taking this to the authorities." But Reed wasn't done yet. His eyes gleamed with something sinister as he leaned forward, locking his gaze on Claire. "You think this ends here? You think taking me down will solve everything? You have no idea how deep this goes. There are others involved, people far more powerful than me. You're playing with fire, Claire." Claire's pulse quickened, a cold sense of dread creeping up her spine. Reed's words sent a chill through the room, and she could feel the weight of his threat hanging in the air. Whoever else was involved in this, they weren't going to go down without a fight. But Claire wasn't afraid. Not anymore. "You've already lost," she said quietly, her voice filled with quiet determination. "No matter what happens next, the truth is out. You can't hide from it." Reed's sneer faltered, but only for a moment. He knew his time was running out, but he wasn't going to go down without a fight. "Take him to court," Michael said, his voice cold. "Make sure he pays for everything he's done." David nodded, already preparing to move forward with the legal proceedings. But as they turned to leave the office, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Reed's final words, his warning, echoed in her mind. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Back at the mansion, the atmosphere was tense but filled with a sense of victory. Michael, Sarah, and Claire gathered in the living room, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. Reed had confessed, and they were one step closer to justice. But there was still so much left unresolved, so many questions about who else had been involved in Claire's kidnapping and why. Michael poured himself a drink, his hands shaking slightly. "We've done it," he said quietly, though his voice was filled with exhaustion. "We've finally brought him down." But Claire wasn't convinced. "What did he mean?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with uncertainty. "When he said this goes deeper, do you think there's more to this than just him?" Michael frowned, setting down his glass. "Reed was always connected to powerful people. I wouldn't be surprised if there were others involved. But for now, we focus on what we know. We have his confession and we'll make sure he pays for what he did." Claire nodded, though the uneasy feeling in her chest remained. She had learned the hard way that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. There was more to this story, more secrets waiting to be uncovered, and until she knew the full truth, she wouldn't be able to rest. As the night wore on, Claire sat by the window in her room, staring out at the darkened garden below. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her, but alongside the fear and uncertainty, there was also a flicker of hope. For the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. She had a family, people who loved her, and together they would face whatever came next. But she knew the battle wasn't over. Not yet. The days following Arthur Reed's confession were a whirlwind. Claire, Michael, and Sarah were left grappling with the fallout, but the tension hadn't lifted. They had Reed's admission and enough evidence to start legal proceedings. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something darker still lurked beneath the surface. His final words echoed in her mind, a haunting warning that there were others involved, people with more power and reach than Reed. The legal process was already underway. David had handed over the evidence to the authorities, and charges against Reed were being prepared. His confession had opened the door to a case that could dismantle the network of corruption that had manipulated the Smith family for years. But Claire knew this wasn't the end. If anything, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter in this story. Reed had been a key player, but he was not the mastermind behind her kidnapping. At the mansion, the atmosphere was tense. Michael was relentless, working with lawyers and David to ensure Reed would face justice. Sarah, however, had grown quieter. The weight of everything, the years of grief, the revelation of Claire's kidnapping, and the impending legal battle was wearing her down. Claire could see it in her mother's face, in the way she moved through the house with a heavy heart. It pained Claire to watch her mother struggle, knowing that the fight was far from over. One evening, after dinner, Michael called Claire into his study. She could tell by his expression that something had shifted. His brow was furrowed, and his eyes were dark with worry. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room, but the warmth did little to ease the tension. "Claire," Michael began, motioning for her to sit down. "David has uncovered something new, something that could change everything." Claire's heart skipped a beat. Every time David brought forward more information, it seemed to uncover new layers of the conspiracy that had taken her from her family. She sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steady, though her pulse quickened. Michael leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. Reed wasn't the only one involved in this. David's found connections to other powerful people who had stakes in our family's business. Some of them were competitors, others were supposed allies. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She had known there were others involved, but hearing Michael confirm, it made the situation feel even more dangerous. This wasn't just about Reed's greed, it was about a network of corruption and betrayal that stretched far beyond him. "Who?" she asked quietly, afraid of what the answer might be. Michael took a deep breath before continuing. "One name keeps coming up. Edward Sinclair." Claire frowned. The name wasn't familiar to her, but judging by the way Michael said it, she knew this person was someone significant. "Sinclair owns one of the largest conglomerates in the country," Michael explained, his voice grim. "He's been a competitor of ours for years, but he was always someone we considered an ally. We've done business together, worked on deals, but it seems he had other plans." Claire's stomach twisted. An ally, someone her family had trusted. "What does he have to do with my kidnapping?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Michael's face darkened. David found evidence that Sinclair was one of the people pulling the strings behind Reed. He wasn't just a competitor. He wanted to control the Smith family business. Taking you was part of his plan to force us into a position of weakness, to make sure we couldn't compete with him. Claire's heart sank. The betrayal cut deeper than she had expected. It wasn't just about business rivalry, it was personal. Someone her family had trusted had orchestrated her disappearance for power and control. "So, it wasn't just Reed," she whispered. "Sinclair was behind it all too." Michael nodded, his expression hard. "And Sinclair is far more dangerous than Reed. He has connections in high places, and he's been careful to cover his tracks. Bringing him down won't be easy." Claire felt a wave of anger wash over her. Sinclair had been part of the conspiracy that had stolen her life, and he had done it with calculated precision. The thought of him getting away with it, of continuing his life and business without consequence, was unbearable. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice filled with determination. "We keep pushing," Michael said firmly. "David's gathering more evidence, but we'll need to be careful. Sinclair has more resources than Reed, and he won't go down without a fight." The days that followed were a blur of meetings and preparations. David continued his investigation, digging deeper into Sinclair's business dealings and uncovering a web of corruption that stretched across industries and political circles. It became clear that Sinclair's influence was vast, and taking him down would require more than just exposing his connection to Claire's kidnapping. They needed to dismantle the entire operation. Claire found herself torn between her desire for justice and the fear of what Sinclair might do if they pushed too hard. Reed had been dangerous, but Sinclair was far more powerful, and his reach extended into places that were difficult to trace. But despite the risks, Claire knew they had to keep going. If they didn't stop Sinclair, he would continue to manipulate and destroy lives for his own gain. One evening, after another long day of discussions with David and the legal team, Claire retreated to the garden. The night was cool, and the stars twinkled above, offering a brief moment of peace in the chaos. She sat on the stone bench near the fountain, the sound of the water soothing her frayed nerves. But even in the quiet of the garden, Claire couldn't escape the weight of what was happening. The more they uncovered, the more she realized how deep the conspiracy went, and it terrified her. As she sat there, lost in thought, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see James, the ever-watchful butler, standing a few feet away. His face was as unreadable as ever, but there was something different in his eyes, something that made Claire's pulse quicken. "James," she said softly, "what is it?" For a moment, James hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the house before returning to Claire. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost cautious. "Miss Claire, there's something you need to know, something I've kept quiet about for a long time." Claire's heart raced. James had been with the family for years, and though he had always been loyal and protective, she had sensed there was something he wasn't telling her. Now it seemed the time had come for him to reveal what he knew. "What is it, James?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James took a deep breath before answering. "I knew about Sinclair. I knew he was involved in your kidnapping." Claire's breath caught in her throat. "You knew? Why didn't you say anything?" "I didn't have proof," James said quickly. "And Sinclair is dangerous, Miss Claire. He has people watching everywhere. If I had spoken up without solid evidence, it could have put you and your family in even more danger." Claire stared at him, her mind reeling. James had known about Sinclair all along, but he had kept quiet out of fear. Part of her understood. Sinclair's power was vast, and confronting him without proof would have been risky. But the betrayal stung nonetheless. "Why tell me now?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Because you're close," James said, his voice filled with urgency. "You're getting close to bringing Sinclair down, and I can't stay silent any longer. I've been watching him for years, and I've seen the damage he's done. He needs to be stopped." Claire nodded, her mind racing with questions. James had kept this secret for years, and now, with the investigation closing in on Sinclair, he was finally revealing the truth. But what else did he know? And how much more danger were they in? "Thank you for telling me," Claire said softly, "but we need to be careful. Sinclair won't go down without a fight." James nodded, his expression grim. "I'll do whatever I can to help. Just be careful, Miss Claire. Sinclair is ruthless, and if he feels threatened, there's no telling what he'll do." Later that night, as Claire lay in bed, the weight of everything pressed down on her. The truth about Sinclair was finally coming to light, but the danger was far from over. She knew they were walking a fine line. One misstep, and Sinclair could retaliate in ways they couldn't predict. But despite the fear, Claire felt a growing sense of resolve. She had spent too many years lost, too many years in the dark about her past. Now that the truth was finally within reach, she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Sinclair had taken everything from her, her family, her childhood, her identity. But now she had the chance to take it all back, and she would, no matter what it took. The storm brewing over Edward Sinclair's involvement in Claire's kidnapping felt like the darkest chapter yet in this unfolding tragedy. The knowledge that James had kept silent for so long haunted Claire. She understood his fear. Sinclair was not a man to cross lightly, but the betrayal was still raw. How many more secrets were buried in her past? And how far was Sinclair willing to go to protect the empire he had built on lies and manipulation? Despite her anger, Claire knew the battle wasn't just personal anymore. This was about dismantling the corruption that had entangled not just her family, but countless others. She wasn't going to rest until Sinclair and everyone else involved was exposed. The next morning, Michael, David, and Claire gathered in the study. The legal team had already begun assembling the case against Arthur Reed, but now, with Sinclair's name at the center, everything had escalated. Taking down Reed was only the beginning. Sinclair was the real enemy. David had been working tirelessly, digging deeper into Sinclair's web of influence. His research had uncovered a sprawling network of politicians, business partners, and corrupt officials who had all benefited from Sinclair's ruthless tactics. It was clear that bringing him down would be dangerous, but the evidence was mounting. "This is bigger than we imagined," David said, spreading a series of documents across Michael's desk. "Sinclair has his hands in everything: finance, real estate, even government contracts. Taking him down will require more than just legal pressure. We're going to need to expose him publicly, hit him where it hurts." Michael nodded, his face lined with determination. "We'll do whatever it takes. I've spoken with some of my old contacts in the media. If we can get enough proof, we'll make sure the world knows what kind of man Sinclair really is." Claire listened quietly, her heart pounding. The thought of exposing Sinclair on such a large scale was daunting, but she knew it was the only way to ensure justice. Sinclair's power came from his secrecy, from the people who turned a blind eye to his crimes. If they could shine a light on everything he had done, they might finally have a chance to bring him down. As the legal team worked behind the scenes, Claire couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she left the mansion, she felt a strange unease, as though someone was following her. It was subtle, a lingering car parked on the street, a figure in the distance that disappeared when she turned around. But it was enough to keep her on edge. One afternoon, while running errands in the city, Claire's phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, a sense of dread creeping up her spine. "Claire," a low, unfamiliar voice said on the other end. "I would be very careful if I were you." Her heart raced, her breath catching in her throat. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled, the sound cold and calculating. "You're digging into things you shouldn't be. Sinclair has eyes everywhere. If you know what's good for you, you'll stop now." The call ended before she could respond. Claire stood frozen in the middle of the sidewalk, her hands trembling as she stared at the phone. Sinclair knew. He knew they were getting closer, and this was his way of warning her off. But instead of fear, Claire felt a surge of anger. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything they had uncovered. Sinclair could try to intimidate her, but she wouldn't let him win. That evening, back at the mansion, Claire told Michael and David about the call. Michael's expression darkened, his protective instincts kicking in. "He's trying to scare you," Michael said, his voice low with anger. "He knows we're closing in." David nodded, his expression grim. "It's a tactic, one he's used before, but it also means he's worried. He wouldn't bother trying to intimidate you if he wasn't feeling the pressure." Claire felt a mixture of fear and determination. The stakes had never been higher, but if Sinclair was feeling threatened, that meant they were on the right track. "What do we do now?" Claire asked, her voice steady. "We keep going," David said firmly. "I found a connection between Sinclair and some of the payments Reed made to Margaret Wills. It's enough to prove that Sinclair was pulling the strings, but we'll need more if we're going to expose him on a larger scale." Michael leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Then we get more. I'll call my contacts in the media. Once we have the full picture, we'll make sure Sinclair's name is everywhere. He won't be able to hide." Claire nodded, though a sense of dread lingered. Sinclair wasn't going to go down without a fight, and she knew they were heading into dangerous territory. But there was no turning back now. As the days passed, the investigation into Sinclair intensified. David worked tirelessly, following every lead. uncovering more connections between Sinclair's business empire and the criminal network that had been responsible for Claire's kidnapping. Michael's media contacts were prepared to go public with the story once they had enough evidence, and the legal team was building a case that could bring Sinclair to his knees. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous things became. Claire's phone buzzed with more anonymous threats, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her every move. Michael insisted on hiring security for the house, but even with the extra precautions, Claire couldn't shake the unease that settled over her like a dark cloud. Late one night, as Claire sat in the living room, flipping through old family photo albums, she heard a knock at the door. It was unusual for anyone to visit this late, and her heart skipped a beat as she got up to answer. When she opened the door, she was greeted by a man she didn't recognize. Tall, well-dressed, with an air of quiet menace. His eyes were cold as he looked at her, and Claire felt a chill run down her spine. "Claire Smith?" the man asked, his voice calm but with a dangerous edge. Claire nodded, her hand tightening on the door. "I'm here to deliver a message," he said, stepping closer. "Stop digging into Sinclair's business. This is your final warning." Claire's breath caught. This was more than just a phone call. This was a direct threat, and the man standing before her didn't seem like someone who would hesitate to follow through. "I think you should leave," Claire said, her voice steady despite the fear rising inside her. The man's lips curled into a cold smile. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. Sinclair isn't someone you want to cross. You and your family would do well to remember that." Claire stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "We're not backing down," she said firmly. "You can tell Sinclair that." The man's smile faded, replaced by a hard, dangerous look. "You've been warned." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Claire closed the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew the danger was real, but she also knew that they couldn't stop now. Sinclair was desperate, and that meant they were close to bringing him down. The next morning, Claire gathered with Michael, Sarah, and David in the study. The atmosphere was heavy with tension, but there was also a sense of determination that hadn't been there before. "We're getting close," David said, his voice filled with resolve. "Sinclair knows it, and that's why he's getting desperate. We have enough evidence now to take this public. Once the story breaks, his empire will crumble." Michael nodded, his expression hard. "Let's do it. We've waited long enough." Claire felt a surge of adrenaline as they finalized their plan. They were about to expose one of the most powerful men in the country, and there was no turning back. The road ahead would be dangerous, but for the first time, Claire felt a flicker of hope. Sinclair had stolen her life, but now she was ready to take it back. The tension in the Smith mansion was palpable as Claire, Michael, Sarah, and David gathered in the study to finalize their plans. The decision had been made. They were going public with the story. The weight of the moment hung over them like a storm cloud, heavy with the promise of retribution and justice. They knew that exposing Edward Sinclair would send shockwaves through the business world and beyond, but they also understood the risks. As they prepared to release the story to the media, the sense of danger was growing. Sinclair had shown that he was willing to go to any lengths to protect himself, and his reach was vast. But now, Claire and her family were determined to bring him down, no matter the cost. David laid out the timeline, going over the steps they would take to ensure the story reached the widest audience possible. "We've got reporters ready to run the story as soon as we give the signal," David said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Once it's out there, Sinclair won't be able to stop it." Michael nodded, his face grim. "We're ready. This ends today." Claire's heart raced as she listened. The thought of finally exposing Sinclair was both thrilling and terrifying. They had spent so long gathering evidence, building their case, and now they were on the brink of tearing down the empire he had built on lies and corruption. But as ready as they were, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. Sinclair wouldn't go down without a fight. She had seen the lengths he was willing to go to in order to protect his secrets, and she knew he had the resources to strike back if they weren't careful. Later that evening, The mansion was quiet. The media outlets had been notified, and the story was set to break the next morning. Michael and Sarah had retired to their rooms, exhausted but resolved, while Claire stayed up, too anxious to sleep. She sat by the window in her room, staring out at the darkened gardens below. The quiet was unnerving, and her thoughts swirled with fear and anticipation. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. Another unknown number. Her heart leapt as she hesitated before answering. Claire Smith. The voice on the other end was cold, eerily calm. She knew immediately who it was. Edward Sinclair. "I hear you've been busy," Sinclair said, his tone dripping with menace. "You really should have stayed out of this." Claire's breath caught, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Your time is up, Sinclair. By tomorrow, the world will know what you did." There was a pause on the other end, then a low, dangerous chuckle. "You think you can stop me with a few news articles? You've underestimated me, Claire. I've been doing this for a long time, and I always come out on top." Claire clenched her fists, her heart pounding in her chest. "Not this time. We have proof of everything. Your connections to Reed, the payments to Margaret Wills, the corruption. It's all going public." Sinclair's voice grew colder. "You're making a mistake, Claire. You don't understand what you're up against. I have more power than you can imagine, and if you think you and your family can walk away from this unscathed, you're wrong." Claire's voice trembled, but her resolve didn't waver. "We're not afraid of you." There was another chilling silence, and when Sinclair spoke again, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "You should be." The line went dead. Claire sat there, her hands shaking as she stared at the phone. Sinclair's threat lingered in the air like a dark cloud, but she knew they couldn't back down now. They were too close to the truth, and she wasn't going to let him intimidate her into silence. The next morning arrived with a sense of eerie calm. The story was released to the media just as planned. Within hours, news outlets across the country were reporting on Sinclair's connection to the Smith family's tragedy and his corrupt dealings. Headlines screamed his name, and the fallout was swift. His reputation, carefully built over decades, began to unravel as more details came to light. Claire watched the news coverage with a mix of satisfaction and dread. She had spent so long wondering who had taken her, why her life had been stolen from her, and now the world finally knew the truth. But there was still an unsettled feeling gnawing at her. Sinclair wasn't the type of man to go down quietly. As the day wore on, the calls started coming in, reporters, lawyers, even old family friends, all reacting to the bombshell revelations. Michael and Sarah were inundated with support, but there were also whispers of fear. Everyone knew Sinclair was powerful, and there were concerns about what he might do in retaliation. By late afternoon, Claire felt a sense of relief begin to wash over her. They had done it. Sinclair was exposed, and his empire was crumbling. But just as she began to let her guard down, David burst into the room, his face pale with urgency. "There's a problem," he said, his voice tight. Michael looked up from his desk, alarmed. "What is it?" "Sinclair's lawyers just filed a countersuit," David said quickly. "They're claiming defamation, saying we fabricated the evidence to ruin his reputation. He's already got high-profile attorneys spinning the story in his favor." Claire's heart sank. Defamation? How could Sinclair still be fighting this? "He's trying to buy time," David continued, his expression grim. "If he can discredit the evidence, he might be able to convince the public that this is all a smear campaign." Michael slammed his fist on the desk, his frustration boiling over. "He's desperate." "But it could work," David warned. "Sinclair has deep pockets, and his connections run far. He could drag this out in court for years." Claire felt the weight of David's words settle over her like a lead blanket. She had thought they were so close to bringing Sinclair down, but now it felt like they were back at square one. How could someone so corrupt still have so much power? "We can't let him win," Claire said, her voice fierce. "There has to be something we can do." David hesitated, then looked at Claire with a mix of hesitation and hope. "There is one more option, but it's risky." Michael narrowed his eyes. "What is it?" David took a deep breath. I've been looking into Sinclair's past, his personal life. There's someone who might have information that could take him down for good. A former business partner who had a falling out with him years ago. She knows things that could destroy him. Claire's pulse quickened. Who is she? Her name is Rebecca Lawson, David said. She used to be Sinclair's right hand, but they had a massive falling out about a decade ago. She disappeared from the public eye after that, but I've tracked her down. If we can get her to testify, she could be the key to ending this. Michael looked skeptical. And why would she help us now? David shrugged. Revenge, maybe. Sinclair burned a lot of bridges when he betrayed her, and she's been off the grid ever since. But if we can convince her to talk, she could give us the leverage we need to finish this. Claire stood up, her mind racing. Let's find her. That night, Claire, Michael, and David set out to track down Rebecca Lawson. The address David had uncovered led them to a quiet, secluded estate on the outskirts of the city. The place had the air of someone trying to stay hidden, and Claire felt a flicker of hope that this woman might be the key to finally ending Sinclair's reign. As they approached the door, Claire's heart pounded in her chest. This was their last chance. If Rebecca Lawson agreed to help, they might have a shot at taking Sinclair down once and for all. But if she refused, David knocked on the door, and after a long, tense moment, it creaked open. A woman stood in the doorway, tall, with sharp features and eyes that held years of pain and betrayal. Rebecca Lawson, David asked. The woman's gaze flicked over the group, her expression unreadable. Who wants to know? David stepped forward, his voice calm but urgent. We need your help. It's about Edward Sinclair. Rebecca's eyes narrowed at the mention of the name, and for a moment, Claire thought she might slam the door in their faces. But then, slowly, Rebecca opened the door wider. Come in, she said, her voice low. It's time someone put an end to him. The tension in Rebecca Lawson's secluded estate was thick as Claire, Michael, and David sat in her dimly lit living room. It was as if time had slowed, each second stretched thin with anticipation. This woman, once Edward Sinclair's closest confidant, held the key to destroying the man who had tormented Claire's family for years. Her sharp gaze swept over them, and Claire could feel the weight of her decision hanging in the air. Rebecca hadn't spoken much after inviting them in. She remained silent, watching them closely as if assessing whether or not to trust them with what she knew. Claire felt her heart pounding in her chest, her palms sweating as she tried to stay calm. Finally, Rebecca broke the silence. You want to take down Edward Sinclair, she said, her voice low and filled with years of suppressed anger. I've waited a long time for this moment. Michael leaned forward, his voice filled with urgency. We have enough to expose him, but we need more, something definitive that will leave no room for doubt, something that will ensure he can't escape justice. Rebecca looked at them, her expression hardening. Sinclair is a master at covering his tracks. He has powerful friends, people who will protect him no matter what. But I know things about him. Things he's worked very hard to keep hidden. If those secrets come to light, it'll be the end for him. Claire's heart raced. This was it. This woman held the final piece of the puzzle, the weapon they needed to finally bring Sinclair down. What kind of secrets? David asked, his voice steady but cautious. Rebecca's lips twisted into a bitter smile. Corruption, bribery, illegal deals. But the worst of it, the things he's done to people. The lives he's ruined, it's all documented, buried deep in his private files. I helped him cover his tracks for years, but I kept copies of everything. I knew one day I might need them. Michael's eyes lit up with hope. You have proof, documents that tie him to these crimes? Rebecca nodded slowly. I do, but bringing Sinclair down won't be easy. He's dangerous, and if he finds out what we're planning, he won't hesitate to strike back. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. Sinclair's reach was vast, and they had already seen the lengths he would go to in order to protect himself. But they couldn't turn back now. We've already started the process, Claire said, her voice filled with quiet determination. The story is out there. The media knows. People are watching. If you help us, we can make sure he pays for everything he's done." Rebecca studied her for a long moment, her sharp eyes seeming to pierce through Claire's resolve. Then, finally, she nodded. "All right," Rebecca said, her voice soft but firm. "I'll help you." Over the next few days, Rebecca worked closely with David and Michael, going through the trove of documents she had kept hidden for years. The files were damning: contracts, wire transfers, and detailed records of illegal activities Sinclair had orchestrated. Every page was another nail in Sinclair's coffin, each document another layer of his empire that would come crumbling down. Claire watched in awe as the case against Sinclair solidified. It was more than she could have ever imagined. Not only had Sinclair orchestrated her kidnapping, but he had built his entire business on corruption and crime, using people like pawns in his ruthless game for power. But with every revelation, the danger grew. David had hired additional security to guard the mansion, knowing that Sinclair wouldn't take this quietly. The phone calls had stopped, but there was an unshakable sense that Sinclair was waiting, planning his next move. As the day of the final confrontation approached, Claire couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fear. This man had stolen her life, her identity, and now she was about to face him, armed with the truth. But the stakes were high, and if Sinclair wasn't stopped, she knew he could destroy them all. The morning of the trial dawned cold and grey. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and members of the public who had followed the unfolding scandal with rapt attention. Claire sat beside Michael and Sarah, her heart pounding as she watched Edward Sinclair enter the courtroom, flanked by his high-profile attorneys. Sinclair's face was as unreadable as ever, his cold, calculating eyes scanning the room. He didn't look at Claire, didn't acknowledge her or her family. He acted as though he was untouchable, as though this entire trial was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But Claire knew better. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched ever so slightly when the prosecution began to lay out the evidence against him. Piece by piece, document by document, the full extent of Sinclair's crimes was revealed. The media had already begun to speculate about how deep the corruption went, and with each revelation, the crowd in the courtroom grew more restless. Rebecca Lawson was called to the stand, her testimony calm and precise. She detailed the illegal deals, the manipulation, and the threats Sinclair had made to maintain control over his empire. The documents she provided were irrefutable, and as she spoke, Claire could see the cracks in Sinclair's facade growing deeper. But it wasn't until David presented the final piece of evidence, the proof of Sinclair's involvement in Claire's kidnapping, that the courtroom truly erupted. The story of Claire's abduction had captivated the nation, and now, with the truth laid bare, there was no turning back. Sinclair's lawyers scrambled to discredit the evidence, but it was no use. The weight of the truth was too much, and for the first time, Sinclair looked truly afraid. Claire watched as the man who had stolen her life, who had caused her family so much pain, was finally cornered. It was over. Sinclair had lost. The trial lasted for days, but the outcome was inevitable. Edward Sinclair was found guilty on multiple counts of corruption, kidnapping, and conspiracy. The sentence was severe: decades in prison, his empire dismantled, his reputation destroyed. As the verdict was read, Claire felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was finally over. The man who had haunted her life for so long was going to pay for what he had done. Michael and Sarah embraced her, their eyes filled with tears of both joy and exhaustion. They had fought so hard for this moment, and now, at last, they could begin to heal. In the weeks that followed, the story of Sinclair's downfall dominated the headlines. His empire crumbled as more people came forward with stories of his corruption, and the media turned its attention to the broader implications of his crimes. For Claire, it was surreal to see her life become part of a national story, but it also brought closure. One afternoon, as she sat in the garden at the mansion, Watching the sunlight filter through the trees, she felt a deep sense of peace for the first time in years. The questions that had haunted her for so long had finally been answered. She had found her family, uncovered the truth, and brought the people responsible to justice. But more than that, Claire had found herself through the darkness, the uncertainty, and the pain. She had discovered her own strength. She was no longer the lost girl who had been taken from her family. She was Claire Smith, a daughter, a fighter, and someone who had reclaimed her life. As the breeze rustled the leaves around her, Claire closed her eyes and smiled. The past was behind her now, and for the first time, the future. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.